Hey guys, in today's video I'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. The Appalachian Trail had always been a bucket list item for me. I'd spent months poring over maps, reading trail journals, and mentally preparing for the grueling trek. Finally, last fall, I carved out a week, packed my gear, and drove down to Georgia to start my adventure. The crisp mountain air was invigorating as I stood at the trailhead, the iconic signpost marking the southern terminus of the AT looming before me. Sunlight dappled through the dense canopy of trees, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was beautiful, serene, and exactly what I'd imagined. My first day was everything a hike should be. The trail wound gently uphill, and the autumn foliage was a riot of reds, oranges, and yellows. Squirrels chattered from branches overhead, and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth hinted at deer or other unseen creatures. I made good time, stopping for lunch by a clear, babbling stream. As afternoon wore on, the trees grew taller, the shadows deeper. The cheerful sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy silence. It wasn't an empty silence, but one that felt watchful, uncomfortable. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation getting to me. I pushed on, determined to reach my planned campsite before nightfall. The trail started to climb more steeply, switchbacks cutting into the side of a ridge. The light was fading fast now, the forest floor swallowed by shadow. I pulled out my headlamp, its beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the gloom. That's when I heard it. A sound, not quite a growl, not quite a scream. It was low, guttural, and seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stopped, headlamp sweeping nervously through the trees, but saw nothing. Just the dark, silent woods. Probably just a bear, I muttered, trying to sound confident even to my own ears. Bears were common in the Appalachians, I knew. But this didn't sound like any bear I'd ever heard. It was wrong. I started walking again, faster now, the unsettling sound echoing in my mind. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper and deeper into the darkening woods. The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling the hairs on the back of my neck. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. Then up ahead I saw it, a flicker of light through the trees. Relief washed over me, a campsite, maybe other hikers. I hurried forward, pushing through the last thicket of rhododendrons. The light wasn't a campfire. It was a glow, pale and unnatural, emanating from a small clearing. And in the center of the clearing, something was moving. Something tall and gaunt, silhouetted against the eerie light. It swayed back and forth, its form indistinct, but undeniably there. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. This wasn't a campsite, and that wasn't a hiker. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, back down the trail, the guttural sound echoing behind me, closer now, and definitely not a bear. My hiking trip to the Appalachian was a deadly mistake, I realized with chilling certainty. And part one was just the beginning. Panic lent wings to my feet. I scrambled back down the trail, branches whipping in my face, lungs burning in the cold air. The guttural sound was definitely pursuing me now, a rhythmic, dragging noise accompanying it. It was faster than I thought, impossibly fast for something so gaunt and indistinct. My headlamp bounced wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the trail roots, rocks, fallen leaves. I tripped, stumbled, catching myself just before I fell headlong. Behind me, the dragging sound grew closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Through the trees, I saw it again. The pale glow in the silhouetted figure, impossibly elongated and spunly, moving with an unnatural jerky gait. It was gaining on me. My breath hitched in my throat. This was no bear, no animal I knew. This was something else. Something wrong with the woods. I pushed myself harder, legs pumping, heart hammering. The trail seemed to twist and turn endlessly, mocking my desperate flight. I could feel the cold dread seeping into my bones, a primal fear that whispered of being hunted. The dragging sound was almost upon me now. I could hear the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves right behind me. Hot, ragged breath hitched in my ears. It was so close. I risked another glance. This time, the headlamp caught it clearly for a horrifying instant. It wasn't just tall and gaunt. Its limbs were too long, grotesquely jointed, ending in hands that looked like skeletal claws. Its head was a pale blur, featureless in the eerie light, but I could sense of eyes. Empty, hungry eyes fixed on me. I screamed. A raw, animal sound torn from my chest, and threw myself sideways off the trail, plunging into the dense undergrowth. Thorns tore at my clothes, branches clawed at my skin, but I didn't care. Anything was better than staying on the trail, staying in its path. I scrambled through the underbrush, pushing through thickets of rhododendrons, stumbling over fallen logs. The dragging sound paused, confused for a moment, then resumed, crashing through the woods to my right, trying to cut me off. It knew where I was going. It was hunting me. Desperation fueled me. I scrambled uphill, hoping to break line of sight, to lose it in the dense foliage. The ground grew steeper, the trees thicker. I was clawing my way up a near vertical slope now, pulling myself hand over hand, ignoring the pain in my muscles, the burning in my lungs. Finally, I reached a small rocky outcrop, a narrow ledge overlooking the forest. I collapsed onto the cold stone, gasping for breath, heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. Below, the forest was a sea of black shadows, broken only by the pale, unnatural glow that still pulsed in the clearing far below. The dragging sound had stopped. Silence descended again, heavy and oppressive. But this time, it wasn't watchful. It was listening, waiting. I knew it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, patient, hunting. And I was trapped on this ledge, exposed, vulnerable. My hiking trip to the Appalachian was a deadly mistake, and part two was turned into a fight for survival. I had to find a way out. But where could I go? And what was that thing in the woods? Trapped on the ledge, I knew I couldn't stay there. The cold was seeping into me, and the creature was still out there listening, waiting. I had to move, to try and find a way back to the trail. Back to what? Civilization. Safety. I wasn't even sure what direction the trailhead was anymore. Taking a shaky breath, I stood up, headlamp beam jittering across the rocks. The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough to walk on, and the drop on either side was sheer and dark. It was a precarious path, but it was the only one I had. I started to move along the ledge, slowly, carefully, each footstep measured. The rock was rough and cold beneath my boots. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth and something else. Something acrid, faintly metallic, that made my stomach churn. As I moved further along the ledge, it began to descend, sloping downwards into a shadowed ravine. The trees here were even taller, their branches intertwined overhead, blotting out almost all the remaining light. It was like walking into a tunnel of living wood. The air grew colder, heavier. The silence intensified, pressing in on me, broken only by the soft crunch of my boots on the rocky path and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I strained my ears, listening for any sound of pursuit, but there was only silence. Too much silence. Then I saw it again, the pale glow deeper in the ravine now, flickering between the trees ahead. It was closer than before. Much closer, and this time there were more of them. 2. No, 3, maybe more pale glows, moving slowly, deliberately through the trees. They were surrounding me, cutting off my escape. I was being herded, driven deeper into their territory. Terror choked me. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing on the narrow ledge. The metallic scent grew stronger, sickeningly sweet now, mixed with a faint, musky odor that made my skin crawl. Whatever those things were, they were close. I had to do something. I couldn't outrun them, not in this terrain. Maybe I could hide. Desperate, I scanned the rocky walls of the ravine, searching for any kind of shelter, and then I saw it, a narrow opening in the rock face, almost hidden behind a curtain of moss and vines. A cave. Small, dark, but maybe it could offer some temporary refuge. Without hesitation, I scrambled towards the opening, tearing away the vines, squeezing myself through the narrow entrance. The cave was small, cramped, and smelled of damp earth and something else of something ancient and stale. But it was dark, blessedly dark, a refuge from the pale glows and the hunting things outside. I huddled in the deepest shadows of the cave, turning off my headlamp, plunging myself into absolute blackness. The silence here was profound, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I closed my eyes, trying to slow my racing heart, to calm the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. But even in the darkness, I could still sense them, outside. Listening. Waiting. The metallic scent drifted into the cave, stronger now, almost overpowering. And then I heard it. A new sound, different from the guttural growl, but even more chilling. A soft, wet scraping sound, just outside the cave entrance. Something was scratching at the rock, probing, testing. It knew I was here. It was toying with me. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it. There was nowhere else to run, nowhere else to hide. My hiking trip to the Appalachian was a deadly mistake and was about to become my end. The scraping stopped. Silence descended again, heavier than ever. Then, slowly, deliberately, the pale glow began to seep into the cave entrance, illuminating the darkness inch by agonizing inch. And I knew with chilling certainty that whatever was coming next, there was no escape. My Appalachian hike was not just a mistake, it was a death sentence. The Nevada desert shimmered under the relentless August sun. We were 4 friends crammed into a slightly too small SUV, windows down, the dry, hot wind whipping through our hair. Caleb was driving, as always, his usual mix of classic rock blasting from the speakers. Maya navigated, her nose buried in a crumpled map, occasionally glancing at her phone, which stubbornly refused to find a signal. Liam, in the passenger seat, was filming everything with his vintage Super 8 camera, obsessed with capturing the authentic desert vibe. And then there was me, Sarah, wedged in the back between Liam and a cooler full of lukewarm drinks, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease prickling at the edges of my excitement. We were on a classic American road trip, chasing Route 66 nostalgia and quirky roadside attractions. But Caleb, ever the adventurous one, had insisted on adding a detour Silver Gulch, a ghost town he'd read about online. Supposedly haunted, he'd said with a grin, perfect for a spooky night. Maya had rolled her eyes, Liam had cheered, and I just shrugged, trying to keep an open mind. I loved ghost stories, but something about the way Caleb had said, haunted, sent a shiver down my spine that wasn't entirely from anticipation. After hours of driving through increasingly desolate landscape, we finally turned off the main highway onto a barely, their dirt road. The SUV bounced and rattled, kicking up plumes of dust that hung in the air like ghostly shrouds. The temperature seemed to rise another 10 degrees, and the landscape became even more stark, just scrub brush cacti, and the endless shimmering heat haze. Then, cresting a low rise, we saw it. Silver Gulch. It wasn't what I'd expected. I'd pictured tumbleweed and saloon doors swinging in the wind. Something out of a Western movie. But Silver Gulch was quieter, stiller, more decayed. A cluster of weathered wooden buildings together in a shallow valley, baking under the sun. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding, roof sagged, and windows were dark, empty sockets staring out at the desert. A rusted sign at the edge of town, barely legible, proclaimed, Silver Gulch Est, 1888, population once thrived. An unsettling silence hung over the town, broken only by the whine of the wind and the occasional creak of loose wood. It felt heavy, oppressive. Even Caleb, usually so boisterous, seemed to quiet down as we drove slowly down the main street, if you could call it that, past the skeletal remains of shops and houses. Whoa, Liam breathed, his camera whirring. Creepy. Maya consulted her map again. Town's supposed to be centered around the old mine, she said, pointing to a dark gash in the hillside looming behind the buildings. Silver Strike Mine. Closed down after a cave in, 100 years ago. And that's when the strange occurrences started. Caleb added, his grin returning, though it seemed a little forced now. Locals say the miners are still down there. Trapped, restless. He parked the SUV in front of what looked like the remnants of a general store. We got out, stretching our stiff limbs, the heat hitting us like a wall. The silence of the ghost town seemed to press in even more outside the car. Dust crunched under our boots as we started to explore. The buildings were mostly empty shells, filled with dust and the ghosts of forgotten lives. We peered into darkened windows, imagining what it must have been like when Silver Gulch was alive. A bustling mining town, full of hope and dreams, now just bones in the desert. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows grew longer, stretching across the dusty streets like grasping fingers. The wind picked up, whispering through the broken windows and swaying the loose boards, creating an eerie, sighing sound. The temperature began to drop, but the oppressive feeling in the air only seemed to thicken. "All right," Caleb said, clapping his hands together a little too loudly. "Who's ready to set up camp? We're sleeping under the stars tonight, ghost town style." Liam whooped, Maya just nodded, but I hesitated. Looking around at the gathering dusk, the empty buildings, the looming mine shaft on the hillside, I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. Something about Silver Gulch felt deeply wrong. More than just a ghost town, it felt hungry. My hiking trip to the Appalachian was a deadly mistake I'd realized before. And now, standing in Silver Gulch, I couldn't shake the feeling that this detour might be an even bigger one. We chose to set up camp in what was left of the town square, a relatively open space in front of the old saloon. Caleb and Liam, fueled by bravado and cheap beer, immediately started exploring the saloon, its swinging doors long gone, interior open to the elements. May, ever practical, began unpacking supplies and organizing our makeshift campsite. I wandered off on my own, drawn by a morbid curiosity to the edge of town, towards the dark mouth of the Silver Strike mine. The mine entrance was a gaping hole in the hillside, framed by rotting timbers and piles of loose rock. A rusted metal sign warned DNGR, Keep Unstable Ground. But it was the silence emanating from the mine that was truly unnerving. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it felt like sound itself was being swallowed by the darkness within. A chill wind seemed to gust from the mine entrance, even though the air was still and heavy everywhere else. It carried that same metallic, acrid scent I'd noticed earlier, now tinged with something elsey, something like decay. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, even though the temperature was still mild. Find anything interesting? Caleb's voice startled me, breaking the oppressive silence. He and Liam emerged from the saloon, grinning, Liam still filming. Just the mine, I said, gesturing towards the dark opening. It's creepy. Creepy good, right? Caleb clapped me on the shoulder too enthusiastically. Come on, let's get a fire going. Spooky stories are always better by firelight. We gathered firewood from fallen branches and scraps of wood we found around the town. As dusk deepened, the shadows stretched and twisted, turning familiar shapes into menacing figures. The wind picked up again, whispering through the empty buildings, sounding almost like voices. Maya got a small campfire going in the center of the square. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows that played tricks on our eyes, making the dilapidated buildings seem to shift and sway. As darkness fully descended, the stars began to appear, blazing with an unnatural brilliance in the clear desert sky. It should have been beautiful, peaceful. But in Silver Gulch, even the stars felt cold and distant, watching us with indifferent eyes. We ate a quick dinner of sandwiches and chips, the fire crackling and spitting, our voices hushed in the surrounding silence. Caleb, trying to lighten the mood, started telling ghost stories he'd found online about Silver Gulch. Tales of miners trapped in the cave and their spirits haunting the town. Strange lights seen flickering in the mine shaft, whispers carried on the wind. Liam ate it up, filming Caleb with relish, his eyes wide with manufactured fear. Maya remained skeptical, picking at her sandwich, but even she seemed a little on edge, her gaze constantly flicking towards the shadows beyond the firelight. I listened to Caleb's stories, but my unease was growing, solidifying into a cold dread. It wasn't just the ghost stories. It was something in the air, the oppressive silence, the way the shadows seemed to move and watch. It felt like Silver Gulch was aware of us, and not happy we were here. As Caleb finished his last ghost story, the fire suddenly popped and flared, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. In the brief flash of light, I saw something move in the shadows at the edge of the square. Just a flicker, a fleeting impression of something tall and gaunt, disappearing back into the darkness between the buildings. I blinked, heart pounding. Did you guys see that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb and Liam were too busy laughing at the end of the story to notice. Maya frowned. See what? Just shadow Sarah. You're getting spooked. No, I saw something, I insisted, but even to my own ears, I sounded unsure. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. But then, the wind shifted again, and the whispering sound intensified, swirling around us, no longer just the wind in the buildings, but something else. Something murmuring, just at the edge of hearing, in a language I didn't understand, but that resonated deep in my bones, a language of dust and shadows and long-buried secrets. And this time I wasn't the only one who heard it. Liam stopped laughing, his camera dropping slightly in his hand. Maya's eyes widened, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. Even Caleb's boisterous grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. The fire crackled again, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist into monstrous shapes. And the whispers grew louder, closer, swirling around us in the night. Nightfall had come to Silver Gulch, and just the beginning of the true horror. We were no longer alone. The whispers intensified, swirling around us, no longer just at the edge of hearing, but pressing in, a chorus of voices just below the threshold of understanding. The firelight danced wildly, casting grotesque shadows that stretched and contorted, mimicking the shapes of the dilapidated buildings, or perhaps something else. Liam, his bravado finally gone, fumbled for his phone, desperately trying to get a signal. Maya, her face pale in the firelight, grabbed a heavy branch from the woodpile, holding it like a weapon. Even Caleb, his usual cocky demeanor vanished, stared wide-eyed into the darkness, his bravado replaced by a primal fear I mirrored in my own heart. What is that? Liam stammered, his voice trembling. His phone remained stubbornly blank. I don't know, Caleb whispered back, his voice hoarse. But I don't like it. The whispering coalesced, taking on a semblance of form, a low, guttural chanting that seemed to vibrate in our chests, resonating with something deep and ancient within us. The metallic, decaying scent intensified, thick and cloying, making it hard to breathe. And then the shadows moved. Not just the dancing shadows of the firelight, but the deeper shadows between the buildings, the shadows under the eaves, the shadows clinging to the very earth itself. They began to writhe and coalesce, detaching themselves from their sources, taking on shapes, elongated, gaunt, vaguely humanoid shapes, just like the fleeting glimpse I'd seen earlier. They emerged slowly, silently, from the darkness, drawn by the firelight, or perhaps by us. Their forms were indistinct, shifting and wavering like heat haze, but their presence was undeniable, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on us. I could sense them now, not just see them, a feeling of ancient malice, of hunger, of something utterly alien and wrong. There were more than I'd thought. Dozens. Maybe more, surrounding the square, ringed around us, cutting off any escape. Their pale, indistinct forms seemed to absorb the firelight, dimming the flames, casting us into an encroaching twilight. Run, Caleb yelled, finally snapping out of his fear-induced paralysis. He grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her to her feet. Liam and I scrambled up after them, adrenaline surging through us, overriding the terror, replacing it with a desperate instinct to survive. We didn't have a plan, no direction, just the primal urge to flee. We ran blindly, stumbling away from the dying fire, plunging into the darkness between the buildings, hoping to break through their encirclement. But they were faster than they looked. As we ran, the shadows shifted, blocking our path, herding us, guiding us deeper into the ghost town, away from the open desert, towards the looming darkness of the Silver Strike mine. The chanting grew louder, closer, the guttural voices swirling around us, laced with a new sound now, a dry, rasping sound, like bones scraping against stone. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift and crumble, the dust swirling up around us, choking us, blinding us. We were separated in the chaos. I lost sight of Caleb and Maya almost immediately. Liam stumbled and fell behind, his camera clattering uselessly on the dusty ground. I kept running, blindly, desperately, weaving between the skeletal buildings, the whispers and chants echoing in my ears, the rasping sound drawing closer, closer. I burst out of the buildings and found myself at the foot of the hillside, facing the gaping maw of the Silver Strike mine. The pale glows pulsed within the mine entrance, beckoning, drawing me in. Behind me, the shadows were closing in, their indistinct forms writhing and shifting, their chanting a deafening chorus. There was nowhere else to go. No escape. Just the mine, the darkness, the whispers. With a sob of despair, I stumbled towards the mine entrance, drawn in by the irresistible pull, the chilling certainty that this was where it was always leading, where Silver Gulch wanted us to be, inside. Claimed, as I crossed the threshold of the mine, plunging into absolute darkness, the rasping sound was right behind me, close enough to touch. And then, I heard it clearly, for the first time, not whispers, not chants, but words, spoken in a voice that was ancient and cold as the desert night, a voice that seemed to come from the very rocks themselves. Welcome home. The voice rasped, and the darkness swallowed me whole. The desert wind howled through the empty buildings of Silver Gulch, carrying with it the whispers of the lost miners, the chanting of the shadows, and the faint, metallic scent of dust and decay. The fire in the town square had burned down to embers, casting no light, offering no warmth. Silver Gulch was silent again, waiting, patient. The gulch had claimed us, and Part 3 was the end, for us at least. But in the silence, in the shadows, the whispers continued, waiting for the next travelers to stray from the highway, to take a wrong turn, to stumble into the deadly embrace of the ghost town. Silver Gulch always welcomes new guests. While some hikers begin their Appalachian Trail journey at Amicalola Falls State Park, we opted for the official start point at Springer Mountain. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Just me, my best friend Mark, and 79 miles of pristine wilderness stretching through the heart of Georgia, culminating in the ascent of Blood Mountain, the highest peak on the Georgia section of the AT. We'd been planning this for months, poring over maps, meticulously packing our gear, and dreaming of conquering the legendary trail. We even consulted AT Camp to find a less crowded start date and ensure we had the best possible experience. Mark, ever the optimist, was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement as we set off. He'd even brought along his battered acoustic guitar, convinced we'd be serenading fellow hikers around a campfire beneath the stars. I, on the other hand, was battling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a sense of foreboding that clung to me like a damp fog. The first few days were uneventful. We fell into the rhythm of the trail, our boots crunching on the fallen leaves, the sun dappling through the dense canopy overhead. We shared stories, laughed at each other's jokes, and marveled at the breathtaking scenery. The Appalachian Trail in Georgia is known for its challenging climbs and stunning views, and it certainly lived up to its reputation. Despite the pleasant weather so far, we knew the mountains could be unpredictable. The thought of sudden snowfall or treacherous conditions added an edge of uncertainty to our journey. We encountered a few other hikers along the way, mostly seasoned through, hikers with weathered faces and miles in their eyes. They shared trail wisdom, warned us about upcoming challenges, and regaled us with tales of their own adventures. One grizzled old-timer, with a beard that reached his chest, gave us a particularly chilling account of a strange encounter he'd had deep in the woods. He spoke of an unnatural stillness, a feeling of being watched, and a fleeting glimpse of something moving just beyond the trees, something that didn't belong. I tried to dismiss it as an old man's ramblings, but his words lingered in my mind, adding to the growing unease I felt. We also met a young woman named Sarah hiking solo with a determination that belied her small stature. She was heading north, like us, and we shared stories and trail snacks as we walked for a while. Mark, naturally, was smitten, and I could see him trying to subtly impress her with his knowledge of local flora and fauna. Sarah, however, seemed more interested in the trail itself, her eyes constantly scanning the path ahead, as if searching for something. As we ventured deeper into the wilderness, the trail became increasingly isolated. The cheerful chatter of birds was replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a twig. The once familiar forest began to feel alien, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels. One evening, as we were setting up camp near a secluded stream, Mark noticed a strange marking carved into the trunk of a nearby oak tree. It was a crudely drawn symbol, unlike anything I'd seen before, a series of intersecting lines and circles that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Mark, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as the work of a bored hiker, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more sinister, a warning perhaps, or a sign that we were not alone. That night, as I lay in my tent, listening to the wind whispering through the trees, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched intensified, and imagined eyes peering at me from the darkness beyond the thin nylon walls of my tent. Every creak and groan of the forest sent shivers down my spine. I longed for the comfort of civilization, the reassuring glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic. But here, in the heart of the wilderness, we were utterly alone, vulnerable, and exposed. The next morning, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to have lifted. Sunlight streamed through the trees, birdsong filled the air, and the forest felt welcoming once more. We convinced ourselves that our fears had been amplified by the darkness and the isolation. Mark joked about the symbol, calling it Appalachian graffiti, and we set off with renewed vigor. However, as the day wore on, the unsettling feeling returned. We started noticing things that seemed out of place, a misplaced rock cairn, an unnatural bend in a branch, footprints that appeared and disappeared without a trace. The forest seemed to be watching us, its silence heavy with unseen eyes. We reached a particularly dense section of the trail. Where the trees grew close together, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the sun. A sense of claustrophobia washed over me, and I felt a prickle of fear on the back of my neck. Mark, too, seemed uneasy, his usual cheerfulness replaced by a grim silence. Suddenly, we heard a rustling in the undergrowth. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then a figure emerged from the trees. It was Sarah, the solo hiker we had met earlier. She looked pale and shaken, her eyes wide with terror. "You have to turn back," she gasped, her voice trembling. "There's something out there, something evil." We exchanged worried glances. Sarah was clearly terrified, but we couldn't make sense of her warning. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What did you see?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze darting nervously towards the trees. "I don't know how to explain it," she whispered. "It's like a shadow, but it moves like a living thing. It has no eyes, but it can see you. It has no voice, but it can whisper your name." Mark scoffed. "A shadow. Come on, Sarah. You're scaring yourself." But Sarah shook her head vehemently. "No, it's real. I saw it. It was watching me, following me. I barely escaped." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The old man's story. The symbol on the tree, the strange occurrences on the trail, it all seemed to be connected. We were not alone in these woods. We tried to convince Sarah to hike with us, to find safety in numbers, but she refused. "It wants me," she said, her voice hollow. "I can't lead it to you." And with that, she turned and disappeared back into the dense undergrowth, leaving us standing there, alone and afraid. We continued on, our pace quickening, our senses heightened. The forest felt alive with unseen threats, the shadows deepening with every step we took. We were no longer enjoying the hike, we were just trying to survive. As dusk approached, we decided to make camp early, seeking refuge in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. We built a fire, hoping the flames would ward off whatever lurked in the darkness. But the fear remained, a constant knot in our stomachs. That night I lay awake in my tent, listening to the crackling of the fire and the whispering of the wind. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. I imagined Sarah alone in the darkness, hunted by the shadow she had described. Suddenly I heard a scream. It was a blood-curdling shriek, filled with terror and pain. It came from somewhere in the distance, but it echoed through the silent forest, sending shivers down my spine. "Mark." I scrambled out of my tent and rushed towards his, my heart pounding in my chest. His tent was empty. The scream echoed again, closer this time, and I knew with a chilling certainty that it was Mark's voice. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight and ran towards the sound, stumbling through the undergrowth, my breath catching in my throat. The scream came again, weaker now, and I followed it, deeper and deeper into the darkness. I emerged into a small clearing, bathed in the eerie glow of the moon, and there in the center of the clearing I saw him. Mark was lying on the ground, his body contorted in pain, his face a mask of terror. And standing over him, a shadowy figure, tall and menacing, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The shadow turned towards me, and I saw it, a glimpse of something ancient and evil, something that should not exist. And then it spoke, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to come from the depths of my soul. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, sending me sprawling to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, its beam dancing wildly across the clearing. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes frantically searching for the shadow, but it was gone, vanished into thin air. I rushed to Mark's side, my hands trembling as I checked for a pulse. Nothing. He was gone. The shadow had taken him. Tears streamed down my face as I knelt beside my friend's lifeless body. The fear that had been building inside me for days finally erupted, a wave of terror that threatened to consume me. I had to get out of there, escape the darkness and the evil that lurked within it. I scrambled to my feet and ran, blindly, through the forest, the memory of Mark's scream and the chilling whisper of the shadow echoing in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, just away from the horror I had witnessed. I ran until I could run no more, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I collapsed on the forest floor, my body racked with sobs. I was alone, lost, and hunted. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, I slowly regained my senses. I had to find help, get back to civilization. But how? I was lost deep in the wilderness with no idea which way to go. Then I remembered Sarah. She had been heading north. If I could find the trail again, maybe I could follow her path, find my way out of this nightmare. I stumbled to my feet and began searching for the trail, my eyes scanning the forest floor for the familiar white blazes. After what seemed like an eternity, I found it. The trail. My lifeline. I followed the trail north, my pace slow and unsteady, my body exhausted and my mind still reeling from the horrors of the night. The forest felt different now, the trees no longer welcoming, but menacing, their shadows hiding unseen dangers. I walked for hours, the silence of the forest broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. I was starting to lose hope, my energy fading, my fear growing with every step I took. Then I saw it. A figure sitting by the side of the trail, Sarah. She looked up as I approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "You made it," she whispered. I collapsed beside her, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. "Mark the shadow," Sarah nodded. No. I saw it. We sat there for a long time, two survivors of a nightmare, sharing our grief and our fear. Sarah told me how she had managed to escape the shadow, how she had been running ever since, hoping to find someone, anyone, to help her. Together, we continued north, our pace slow but determined. We were no longer just hiking the Appalachian Trail. We were escaping it, fleeing the darkness that had claimed our friend. We walked for days, our bodies aching, our minds haunted by the memories of what we had seen. But we kept going, driven by the hope of reaching civilization, of leaving the nightmare behind. Finally, we emerged from the forest, stumbling onto a dirt road. A car approached in the distance, its headlights cutting through the morning mist. We flagged it down, our hearts pounding with relief. The driver, a kindly old woman, took us to the nearest town, where we contacted the authorities and reported what had happened. They searched the forest, but they never found Mark's body. The shadow had taken him, leaving no trace. I returned home a changed person, haunted by the memories of my hiking trip to the Appalachian Trail. The once familiar forest now held a dark secret, a chilling reminder of the evil that lurked within its shadows. I never went hiking again. The crisp mountain air whipped through my hair as I wrestled with the tent poles, the sun already sinking below the horizon. "Need a hand, James." Ava's voice was laced with amusement as she effortlessly secured her own tent nearby. I gritted my teeth, my city slicker fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar equipment. "Just a sec," I muttered, finally managing to snap the last pole into place. This was supposed to be our escape. A chance for me and Ava, my adventurous girlfriend, to trade the urban jungle for the real deal Yosemite National Park. We'd spent weeks meticulously planning this trip, poring over trail maps, comparing lightweight gear, and even practicing our bare bag hanging techniques. We were both experienced hikers, confident in our abilities to navigate the wilderness. But as the last rays of sunlight faded, casting long, eerie shadows across the campsite, a prickle of unease ran down my spine. The drive to Yosemite had been a blur of scenic highways and excited chatter. We'd marveled at the towering sequoias, the sheer granite cliffs, and the cascading waterfalls. We'd even spotted a small herd of wild horses grazing by the roadside, their manes flowing in the wind like something out of a dream. But now, with the darkness closing in, the idyllic scenery seemed to take on a more sinister edge. Our campsite, nestled beside the Merced River, was undeniably beautiful. The sound of rushing water was a constant, soothing presence, and the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We'd cooked a simple meal over a crackling campfire, sharing stories and laughter as the stars began to pepper the inky canvas above. But as the flames died down, a chilling silence descended upon the forest. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it felt almost unnatural. Zipping ourselves into our tent, we snuggled close for warmth. The sounds of the forest resumed, the rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a coyote. But beneath these familiar sounds, there was something else. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. A feeling of being watched. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to my overactive imagination. But deep down, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in my chest. We were not alone in this wilderness. Something was out there, lurking in the shadows. Something ancient and malevolent. And as I drifted off to sleep, a terrifying premonition gripped me, This hiking camping trip was a deadly mistake. The night was a symphony of unsettling sounds. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Ava, thankfully, seemed oblivious to my growing fear, her breathing slow and even beside me. I envied her peaceful slumber, wishing I could dismiss the unease that clung to me like a shroud. Hours crawled by. The moon, a pale disk in the inky sky, cast long distorted shadows that danced and writhed around our tent. I imagined eyes peering at us from the darkness, unseen creatures with predatory gazes. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the night. It was a sound of pure terror, raw and primal, and it sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. Ava bolted upright, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. We scrambled out of the tent, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The scream had come from somewhere deeper in the woods, but there was no sign of any struggle, no further cries for help. An eerie silence descended upon the campsite. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We stood there, frozen in fear, our flashlights illuminating nothing but the dense undergrowth and the towering trees. Then we saw it. A figure, shrouded in shadow, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and gaunt, with unnaturally long limbs, and its head was tilted at an unsettling angle. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was enough to send a wave of terror washing over us. We fumbled for our bear spray, our fingers trembling with fear. But before we could react, the figure vanished into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. We were left alone once more, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the forest. Ava was shaking uncontrollably, her face pale with fear. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to leave now." I nodded, my own fear mirroring hers. We scrambled back into the tent, throwing our belongings into our backpacks. We didn't bother taking down the tent, didn't care about leaving a trace. All that mattered was escaping this place, this cursed forest that had become our nightmare. As we fled the campsite, the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky a pale gray. But the rising sun offered no comfort, no sense of safety. We knew that whatever lurked in those woods, whatever had let out the terrifying scream, was still out there, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. This hiking camping trip was a deadly mistake, and we were running for our lives. The rising sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, but the beauty of the dawn did little to quell the terror that gripped us. We stumbled through the wilderness, our bodies exhausted, our minds reeling from the horrors of the night. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger, every whisper of wind a sinister message. We had abandoned the trail hours ago, our desperate flight leading us deeper and deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. Thorns tore at our clothes, branches whipped our faces, and the uneven terrain threatened to send us tumbling down hidden ravines. But we pressed on, driven by the primal instinct to survive. Ava, usually so sure-footed and confident, was now a shadow of her former self. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face pale and drawn. She stumbled frequently, her strength waning with every passing hour. I supported her as best I could, my own fear masked by a desperate need to protect her. We had no food, no water, and no idea where we were going. The forest had become a labyrinth, its paths twisting and turning, leading us in circles. We were lost, alone, and hunted. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat became oppressive. Our throats were parched, our lips cracked and bleeding. We stumbled upon a small stream, its water a lifeline in the desolate landscape. We drank deeply, the cool liquid offering a momentary respite from our ordeal. But our relief was short-lived. As we knelt by the stream, a movement caught my eye. There, on the opposite bank, stood the figure from the night before. It was closer now, its details more horrifyingly clear in the daylight. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over its skeletal frame. Its eyes were black pits, devoid of any emotion. And its mouth was a grotesque gash, filled with rows of needle, sharp teeth. We scrambled to our feet, our bodies fueled by a fresh surge of adrenaline. We fled once more, our escape a desperate scramble through the undergrowth. The creature followed, its movements unnaturally swift and silent. We were running out of time. Our strength was fading, our hope dwindling. We stumbled into a small clearing, a circle of sunlight piercing the dense canopy above. In the center stood an ancient oak, its branches gnarled and twisted like the limbs of a demon. As we collapsed at the base of the tree, our bodies spent, our minds broken, the creature emerged from the shadows. It approached slowly, its gaze fixed on us with a chilling intensity. This was it. The end of our journey, the culmination of our deadly mistake. We closed our eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But the attack never came. Instead, a voice, raspy and ancient, filled the clearing. "You are not welcome here," it whispered. "This is not your place." We opened our eyes to see the creature standing before us, its form shimmering, its edges blurring. It was fading, dissolving into the very air around us. And then it was gone. We were left alone in the clearing, surrounded by the silence of the forest. We had survived, but at what cost? The memory of the creature, the terror of the night, would forever haunt our dreams. Our hiking camping trip was a deadly mistake, and we would carry the scars of that mistake for the rest of our lives. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city and enjoy the beauty of nature. My friends Ashley, Josh, and I had been planning this hiking trip to the Appalachian Trail for months. We were all experienced hikers, having tackled challenging trails like the time we got caught in a blizzard in the Rockies. But something about this trail felt different. Locals told us stories about missing hikers and strange occurrences on the trail, but we dismissed them as folklore. We were confident that we could handle anything the trail threw at us. Ashley, with her fiery red hair and infectious laugh, was the life of the party. She was always up for an adventure, and she had a knack for finding the best campsites. Despite her cheerful facade, Ashley had a deep-seated fear of the unknown, a fear she masked with bravado. Josh, with his quiet demeanor and dry wit, was the voice of reason. He was always prepared for anything, and he had a calming presence that made us feel safe. He carried a worn, leather-bound journal with him, filled with notes and sketches from his past adventures, a habit he developed after a near-death experience climbing Mount Rainier. And me, I was the photographer of the group, always looking for the perfect shot. I loved capturing the beauty of nature, and I was excited to document our journey. I had a new camera for this trip, a top of the line mirrorless model that I was eager to put through its paces. We set off on a Friday morning, full of excitement and anticipation. The trail was a tapestry of vibrant greens and earthy browns, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. We hiked for hours, the only sounds our own footsteps and the occasional chirp of a bird. As the sun began to set, we found a clearing and set up camp. The scent of wood smoke filled the air as we built a fire, the crackling flames casting a warm glow on our faces. We cooked dinner, sharing stories and laughter as the stars emerged in the darkening sky. It was the perfect start to our trip. Little did we know that this idyllic scene would soon turn into a nightmare. The next morning, we woke to a dense fog that had rolled in overnight, blanketing the forest in an eerie silence. The once vibrant colors of the trail were muted, the trees looming like shadowy figures in the mist. A sense of unease settled over us, a feeling that something was amiss. Ashley, usually the first one up, was unusually quiet, her laughter replaced with a nervous fidgeting. Josh, ever the pragmatist, suggested we wait for the fog to clear before continuing our hike. But I, eager to capture the ethereal beauty of the fog-laden forest, convinced them to press on. We set off into the mist, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The fog was so thick that we could barely see more than a few feet ahead, the trail markers our only guide. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the leaves. As we hiked, I noticed that the trail markers seemed to be getting further apart, the path becoming less defined. I mentioned this to Ashley and Josh, but they dismissed my concerns, their confidence shaken but still present. Suddenly, Ashley stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We listened intently, but all we could hear was the pounding of our own hearts. Then we heard it again, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the depths of the fog. It was unlike any animal sound I had ever heard before. Fear gripped us, our blood turning to ice. We huddled together, our flashlights cutting through the mist, searching for the source of the sound. The growl grew louder, closer, and then we saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing red in the fog, emerged from the trees. They were huge, predatory eyes, filled with a malevolent intelligence. A monstrous shape began to take form in the mist, its outline shifting and distorted. Panic surged through us, our instincts screaming at us to run. We turned and fled, stumbling blindly through the fog, the growls echoing behind us. We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline masking the pain of our injuries. The creature lunged at us, its claws raking the air. We dodged just in time, the creature's weight crashing into the undergrowth. We didn't look back, our only thought escape. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs ached, the growls fading into the distance. Finally, we stumbled out of the fog, the trail marker a welcome sight. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. We had survived, but at a cost. Ashley had a deep gash on her arm, and Josh was limping badly, his ankle twisted. My precious camera, was gone, lost in the chaos of our escape. We made our way back to the trailhead, our minds reeling from the encounter. We reported the incident to the park rangers, but they dismissed our story as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the dense fog. They showed us reports of other hikers who had similar experiences, their stories dismissed as well. We left the Appalachian Trail that day, forever scarred by the experience. The idyllic weekend getaway had turned into a fight for survival. We had faced the unknown and lived to tell the tale, but the memory of those glowing red eyes in the fog would forever haunt our dreams. The Appalachian Mountains stretched out before us, a tapestry of deep greens and blues under the vast summer sky. It was the first day of our annual camping trip, and excitement crackled in the air like the impending campfire. There were 5 of us, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and me, Jenny. We'd been friends since high school, and this yearly escape into the wilderness had become a sacred ritual. This year we'd ventured deep into the heart of the Appalachians, seeking a secluded clearing Dave had discovered on a solo hike a few months back. It was perfect, a hidden gem nestled amongst towering pines, with a crystal, clear stream gurgling nearby. As we set up our tents, laughter and chatter filled the air, a comforting symphony against the backdrop of rustling leaves and chirping crickets. With the last tent staked, we turned our attention to the campfire. Dave, ever the outdoorsman, had already gathered an impressive pile of firewood. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, we huddled around the growing flames, the warmth chasing away the evening chill. 5 chairs, one for each of us, encircled the fire, their silhouettes stark against the flickering light. We were halfway through a round of beers, sharing stories and jokes, when I noticed it. A 6th chair. It sat slightly apart from the others, as if inviting an unseen guest to join our circle. My heart skipped a beat. Where did that come from? I blurted out, my voice laced with confusion. Everyone looked at me, then at the chair, their faces mirroring my bewilderment. We only brought 5, right? Sally asked, her voice a nervous tremor. We all nodded, a sense of unease creeping into our cheerful gathering. Each of us had brought our own chair, carefully chosen for comfort and portability. There was no reason for a 6th to appear. Dave, ever the pragmatist, tried to rationalize it. Maybe we miscounted, he offered, but the doubt in his eyes betrayed his words. We scarred our memories, retraced our steps, but the mystery remained. There was no logical explanation for the extra chair. As darkness deepened, the shadows from the surrounding trees stretched and danced, twisting into grotesque shapes in our peripheral vision. The once comforting crackle of the fire now seemed to whisper secrets in an unknown tongue. The air grew heavy with a palpable sense of dread, and the laughter died in our throats. Who started the fire? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, unanswered. None of us could recall who had struck the first match. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I felt a cold sweat prickling my skin. Suddenly, Sally gasped, her eyes wide with terror. I think the person standing behind Jenny did it, she stammered, pointing a trembling finger towards me. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. Only the impenetrable darkness of the forest, watching us with unseen eyes. The unspoken realization dawned on us all. We were not alone. Fear began to gnaw at us, slowly but surely, as we tried to come to terms with the eerie situation. Someone or something was with us in this isolated wilderness, an unseen entity that seemed to mock us with its ghostly presence. We decided to stick together, huddled as close as we could. We pulled our chairs closer to the campfire, as if the flickering flames could somehow shield us from whatever lurked in the darkness. We talked, our voices trembling, trying to break the unnerving silence with forced stories and jokes. But our laughter sounded hollow and insincere. Ava started telling a ghost story she had once heard, a story about a group of hikers who had vanished without a trace in these very woods. She spoke of local legends about wandering spirits and supernatural creatures that haunted these mountains. Her words sent chills down our spines, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As she was speaking, a sudden scream pierced the night, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest, filled with pain and terror. We jumped to our feet, hearts pounding in our chests. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the surroundings, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness, which seemed to be closing in. "What was that?" Dave asked, his voice shaky. I don't replied, tears welling up in her eyes. "But I'm scared." We sat huddled around the fire, afraid to move. Fear had paralyzed us. We didn't know what to do or where to go. We were trapped in a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. And then we heard footsteps. Footsteps approaching. Heavy and steady footsteps. Someone or something was walking towards us. The footsteps grew louder, closer, sending shivers down our spines. We gripped our flashlights, their beams dancing nervously in the darkness. The fire, our only source of light and warmth, seemed to shrink under the oppressive weight of the approaching presence. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with long, slender limbs that moved with an unnatural fluidity. Its skin was pale and sickly, almost translucent in the firelight. Its eyes were black and empty, like the void of outer space. It had a mouth full of sharp teeth, and I could see its ragged breathing as it approached. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The creature stopped just outside the circle of our chairs, its gaze sweeping over us like a predator sizing up its prey. Then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "You have disturbed my rest," it said. "No, you will pay the price." Panic erupted. We scrambled to our feet, knocking over chairs and scattering in all directions. The creature lunged, its long arms reaching out to grab us. I tripped and fell, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. I lay there, helpless, as the creature loomed over me. But then, something unexpected happened. The creature hesitated, its gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned my head and saw Ava standing there, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. She raised her hand, and a bolt of energy shot out from her fingertips, striking the creature in the chest. The creature screamed, a sound that was both terrifying and strangely beautiful, staggered back, its body convulsing. Then it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a faint smell of sulfur. We were stunned, speechless. Ava, who had always been the quietest and most reserved of our group, had somehow saved us. But how? And what was that creature? As dawn broke, we packed up our things and left that cursed clearing. We never spoke of what happened that night, but the memory of it haunted us forever. We knew that we had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that lurked in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, waiting for its next victims. And we knew that we were lucky to have escaped with our lives. Hi, I'm Alex, and I just got back from what was supposed to be an epic solo hiking and camping trip to Yosemite National Park. I've been planning this for months, ever since I saw those stunning photos online, the granite cliffs, giant sequoia trees, and those crystal clear waterfalls. I needed to disconnect, get away from the city noise, and breathe some fresh mountain air. Nature. I thought Yosemite would be the perfect place. I'm not a newbie when it comes to hiking. I've done a fair share of trails around California, but Yosemite was always the big one, the ultimate challenge. I packed my best gear, studied the maps, got all the permits, and felt like I was ready for anything. I decided to go for a 3-day, 2-night backpacking trip, aiming for some of the less crowded trails on the park's eastern side. The drive up was amazing. As I got closer, the landscape started changing, and those massive rock formations began to appear. It was breathtaking. I arrived at the trailhead early Friday morning, feeling pumped and ready to go. The weather was perfect, sunny, crisp, and that mountain air was as fresh as advertised. The first few hours of hiking were incredible. The trail wound through pine forests, and every now and then, I get a glimpse of those iconic Yosemite views. I even saw a deer grazing peacefully in a meadow. I set up my first campsite near a small creek, just as the sun started to dip behind the mountains. Everything felt right, peaceful. Exactly what I needed. That night, though, things started to feel a little off. It started subtly. Just little noises in the woods. I'm used to animal sounds when camping, but these were different. Not the usual rustling of leaves or the hooting of owls. These were heavier, like something big moving around in the trees. I told myself it was probably just a bear or maybe a mountain lion and tried to ignore it. I made sure my food was properly stored in a bear canister, zipped up my tent, and tried to get some sleep. But the noises kept getting louder, closer. And then there were other sounds. Something like scraping, like claws on bark, maybe. And then a low, guttural growl that definitely didn't sound like any animal I knew. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my headlamp and cautiously unzipped the tent flap, peering out in the darkness. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the beam of my headlamp reflecting back at me. I scanned around, listening intently, but all I could hear was the wind rustling through the pines and the creek babbling nearby. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe the solitude was getting to me already. I zipped the tent back up, telling myself to relax. It was just my imagination running wild. I was in Yosemite, after all. Probably just some overactive squirrels. Yes, that's all it was. I tried to sleep again, but the unease lingered. The forest felt different now. Less welcoming. More watchful. I tossed and turned for hours, the strange noises occasionally returning, always just on the edge of hearing, always just out of sight. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. But even in my dreams, I could hear those sounds. The heavy footsteps, the scraping, the growling. And something else too. Something I couldn't quite place. Something almost like whispering. I woke up before dawn, feeling tired and strangely anxious. The forest was quiet again, bathed in the soft pre-dawn light. Birds started to chirp. Everything seemed normal. But that feeling of unease, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, it wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. And I had 2 more days to go. I decided to shake off the weirdness of the previous night and focus on the day ahead. Sun was coming up, the air was crisp and clean, and the trail was calling. I made a quick breakfast, packed up camp, and started hiking again. The plan for today was to reach a higher elevation point with panoramic views and set up camp near a lake I'd read about. The morning hike was beautiful. The trail climbed steadily, winding through granite boulders and open meadows. The views were getting more and more spectacular with every step. I tried to push the creepy night sounds out of my head, focusing on the scenery and the physical challenge of the hike. For a while it worked. I even started to feel like myself again, the initial excitement of the trip returning. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a viewpoint overlooking a vast valley. It was exactly the kind of view I'd come to Yosemite for. Towering cliffs, waterfalls cascading down, and miles of untouched wilderness stretching out before me. I sat there for a long time, eating my sandwich and just soaking it all in. It was moments like these that made all the planning and effort worthwhile. But even in the bright sunshine, with that incredible view, a little seed of unease remained. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt wrong. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent. As I continued hiking in the afternoon, the trail started to change. It became narrower, steeper, and the trees grew closer together, blocking out more and more of the sunlight. The forest grew darker, and the air felt heavier, colder. It was still beautiful, in a wild, untamed way, but the peacefulness from the morning was gone, replaced by a sense of foreboding. Then I started noticing things on the trail, strange markings on the trees. Not like animal scratches, but deliberate, almost carved symbols. They were simple, geometric shapes, triangles, lines, but they looked old, weathered, like they'd been there for a very long time. I tried to take photos, but my phone signal was non-existent out here, and I didn't have a proper camera. The unsettling feeling grew stronger with each step. It wasn't just the sounds from the previous night anymore. It was something else. Something in the air. a sense of being watched, of being unwelcome. I reached the lake late in the afternoon. It was beautiful, nestled in a high mountain basin, surrounded by towering pines. But even the beauty felt tainted somehow, overshadowed by the growing dread that was settling over me. I found a secluded spot near the lakeshore and started setting up camp. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see something. I didn't know what, but I knew something was out there. The sun started to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the lake. The temperature dropped quickly, and a cold wind started to whisper through the trees. I hurried to finish setting up camp, wanting to get inside my tent before darkness completely fell. Just as I was zipping up the tent, I heard it again, that scraping sound. Closer this time. Much closer. It was coming from just outside the tree line, maybe 50 feet away. And then the heavy footsteps, pounding on the ground. Moving towards me, my breath hitched in my throat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. This wasn't squirrels. This wasn't bears. This was something else. Something predatory. I froze listening, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps stopped just outside the trees. The scraping continued closer now, right at the edge of the clearing. And then, a new sound, a soft, wet sniffing, like something was smelling the air, smelling me. I held my breath, paralyzed with terror, listening to the sounds getting closer, circling my campsite in the growing darkness. Whatever was out there, it was definitely not friendly, and it was definitely interested in me. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I just lay there in my tent, listening to the sounds circling me. The sniffing, the scraping, the heavy footfalls just beyond the trees. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only minutes. Minutes that stretched out into an unbearable, terrifying stillness. Then, the whispering started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind and the rustling leaves. Just a low murmur, like voices carried on the breeze. But it grew louder, clearer, weaving its way into my ears, into my mind. It wasn't in any language I knew. It was something older, more primal. Syllables that resonated deep in my bones, filled with a chilling, alien intent. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the tent, pressing in on me. They spoke of things I didn't understand, but somehow I felt them. Felt the cold dread seeping into my soul, the sense of ancient malice directed right at me. Suddenly the scraping stopped. The footsteps ceased. The sniffing faded away. The only sound was the whispering, now louder than ever, and the frantic pounding of my heart. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, waiting for something. Then the tent shook, not violently, but a slow, deliberate tremor, like something large was leaning against it. The whispering intensified, swirling around me, and the tent fabric pressed inwards, as if something heavy was pushing against the outside. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever was coming. The pressure increased, the tent poles creaking and groaning. I could feel something massive right outside, its presence suffocating, overwhelming, and then a sound right next to my ear, so close it made me jump with a sharp, wet crack. Tent ripped. A long, jagged tear appeared in the fabric right beside my head. Cold night air rushed in, and through the opening I saw it. Just an eye at first. Huge, yellow, gleaming in the darkness, reflecting the faint starlight like a predator's eye in the night. It was close, inches away from my face, staring right at me through the ripped tent fabric. Then, more of it came into view, a massive head, vaguely canine, but distorted wrong, covered in coarse, matted fur the color of shadow and earth. Long, pointed teeth glinted in the darkness and thick. Black claws scraped against the tent fabric, tearing it wider. The whispering intensified, pouring out of the creature, filling my head, drowning out everything else. It was a voice, but not a voice. More like a feeling, a raw, predatory intent projected directly into my mind. It spoke of hunger, of claiming, of belonging. I screamed. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. Everything after that became a blur of terror and adrenaline. I scrambled backwards, kicking at the creature, tearing at the tent fabric, desperate to get away. Somehow, I managed to rip a bigger hole in the tent and scramble out the back. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran blindly into the darkness. Crashing through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots and rocks, the creature's guttural growls, and the relentless whispering echoing behind me. I ran for what felt like hours, adrenaline fueling my flight, terror driving me onward. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. Just away. Away from the lake, away from whispers, away from the creature. Eventually, exhaustion took over. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. I was still deep in the woods, surrounded by trees and shadows, but the sounds of pursuit had faded. For now, I huddled there for the rest of the night, shivering in the cold, too terrified to move, too exhausted to run further. As dawn finally broke, painting the sky with pale light, I slowly, cautiously, started to make my way back towards the trail. The hike out was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those yellow eyes, to hear those chilling whispers again. But there was nothing. Just the silent, watchful forest. I finally reached the trailhead late Saturday afternoon, hours later than planned. I stumbled into my car, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Yosemite. Miles away from those woods. I'm home now. Safe, I think. But I can still hear the whispers sometimes, in the quiet moments, just at the edge of hearing. And I still see those yellow eyes in my nightmares. I don't know what it was out there. Some kind of animal. Something else. I don't want to know. I just know I'm never going back to Yosemite. Never going back into those woods. Some places are beautiful, yes. But some places are just deadly. And some mistakes you just don't come back from. My name is Jake, and I guess you could say I'm the reason we were all there that weekend. Every year, me and my buddies try to find a new spot for our annual camping trip. This year, I picked Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I'd seen some pictures online, misty blue mountains, ancient forests, looked like the perfect place to get away from it all, you know. So, there we were, 4 of us crammed into my old Jeep, heading deep into Tennessee. There's me, Jake, always the planner. Then there's Chris, my best friend since kindergarten, the quiet, observant type. We had Marcus, the jokester of the group, always ready with a dumb pun or a loud laugh. And rounding us out was Emily, Chris's girlfriend, who was way tougher than she looked, despite being the only one of us who actually read the park's safety guidelines. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that made everything look a little spooky even then. We found our campsite, a secluded spot near a creek that gurgled and whispered like it was telling secrets. Unloading the gear, Marcus was already cracking jokes about bears and mountain lions, while Emily meticulously checked our food storage, making sure everything was properly sealed. Chris just stood there, quiet as usual, looking up at the darkening woods, a thoughtful frown on his face. As the last light faded, we got a fire crackling, the flames snapping and popping, throwing sparks up into the night sky. We sat around it, the warmth chasing away the evening chill, the smell of pine and wood smoke filling the air. Marcus started in on a ghost story he'd heard about these mountains. Something about a hiker who'd vanished without a trace, leaving only his boots behind. Typical Marcus, always trying to amp up the scare factor. "Relax, dude," Emily said, rolling her eyes. "We're fine. It's a national park, not some haunted wilderness." "Yeah, but still," Marcus grinned. "Imagine if." He didn't get to finish his sentence because just then, a twig snapped in the woods beyond the firelight, and we all went silent, every nerve on high alert. It was probably just some animal, a deer or a raccoon, but out here in the dark, with the shadows dancing all around us, it sounded like something else entirely. Something watching. We all froze listening. The fire crackled, mocking the silence that had fallen over us. Then, another snap, closer this time. Marcus, for once, was speechless, his eyes wide and fixed on the tree lane. Even Chris seemed a little on edge, his usual calm replaced by a subtle tension in his shoulders. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out a little too high-pitched even in my own ears. I grabbed a thick branch from the woodpile, just in case. Emily, ever practical, reached for the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees at the edge of our campsite. Nothing, just leaves rustling in the slight breeze, shadows playing tricks on our eyes. See. Nothing, Emily said, letting out a nervous laugh, but she kept the flashlight clutched tight in her hand. We all tried to relax, to go back to the easy banter of before, but the mood had shifted. The woods felt different now, less welcoming, more watchful. We ate dinner, mostly in silence, the sounds of the forest amplified in the stillness. Every rustle, every hoot of an owl made us jump. Marcus, despite his earlier bravado, kept glancing nervously into the darkness, his jokes replaced by forced, uneasy chuckles. Even the fire seemed to be burning lower, its light struggling to hold back the encroaching shadows. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, I heard it again. A soft padding sound like footsteps on leaves, circling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I nudged Chris, who was already lying in his sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling. He heard it too. We both lay there, listening, our hearts pounding against our ribs. "Think it's a bear," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Chris shook his head slowly. "Doesn't sound like a bear." "Mountain lion." Another head shake. Too light and too deliberate. Deliberate. That word hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken dread. It wasn't just a random animal wandering through the woods. This felt intentional, like something was out there, circling us, studying us. The padding sound stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence that stretched on and on. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything, but there was nothing. Just the whisper of the creek, the crackle of the dying fire, and the frantic beat of my own heart. Whatever it was gone. Or maybe it was just waiting. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I drifted off, some sound from the woods would jolt me awake again. The wind seemed to pick up, rustling the leaves and branches, turning the forest into a whispering, sighing entity that surrounded us. I kept imagining eyes out there in the dark, watching us from between the trees. When morning finally came, it was a pale, gray dawn, the sky heavy with clouds. The woods looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but still altered. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, it had just receded, lurking beneath the surface. We ate a quick breakfast, no one saying much. Even Marcus was subdued, his usual energy replaced by a quiet nervousness. Emily kept glancing around, her eyes scanning the trees, the creek, the shadows that still clung to the edges of the campsite. Chris was just silent, his gaze distant, like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. "Let's hike to Klingman's Dome today," I suggested, trying to inject some enthusiasm into the group. "Get some views, Maybe clear our heads." It was supposed to be the highest point in the park, a popular spot with an observation tower. I figured being around other people, even just for a little while, might help shake off the unease that had settled over us. Everyone agreed, though without much excitement. We packed up our day packs, doused the fire, and started off down the trail. The woods were thick and silent, the air heavy and damp. The path wound upwards, switchbacking through ancient trees, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy. As we climbed higher, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was almost a presence, a weight in the air. Every now and then, I'd catch a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow shifting between the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then we heard it again. The padding sound. The soft footsteps on leaves, but this time closer, much closer. It was keeping pace with us, just off the trail, moving through the undergrowth. We stopped, all of us listening, our breath held tight in our chests. The sound stopped too. Silence. Then a twig snapped, right beside the trail just a few feet away. We all jumped back, our hearts leaping into our throats. And then we saw it. Not an animal, not a bear, not a mountain lion, not anything we could name. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over sharp bones. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was a jagged tear in its face, filled with teeth that were too long, too sharp. It stood there motionless, watching us, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within its chest. We didn't scream, we didn't move, we just stared, frozen in terror, at the thing that had been circling us in the dark, the thing that had been watching us from the woods. It took a step closer, and another, and then it lunged. My name is Ethan, and I've always been a sucker for the outdoors. There's just something about being surrounded by nature, away from the hustle and bustle of city life, that really recharges my batteries. So when my friends Sarah and Josh suggested a camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, I was immediately on board. We planned the trip for late October, hoping to catch the last bit of fall foliage before the real cold set in. Sarah, ever the planner, booked us a spot at the Elkmont campground. She'd read online that it was one of the best campgrounds in the park, nestled right along the little river and surrounded by old growth forest. Josh, on the other hand, was in charge of gear and food. He's the kind of guy who's always prepared for anything, sometimes to an almost comical degree. He showed up at my place the morning of our departure with enough camping equipment to outfit a small army, and enough food to last us a week, even though we were only going for a long weekend. The drive to the Smokies was beautiful. As we got closer to the park, the landscape transformed into rolling hills covered in vibrant shades of red, orange, and gold. The air grew crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. By the time we reached Elkmont, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campground. Our campsite was perfect. It was secluded, surrounded by tall trees that muffled the sounds of other campers, and just a short walk from the river. We quickly set up our tents, started a fire in the fire pit, and began unpacking. The crackling flames and the gentle murmur of the river created a cozy and peaceful atmosphere. As darkness fell, the woods around us came alive with the sounds of the night. Crickets chirped, owls hooted in the distance, and the wind rustled through the leaves. We sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories, the kind of easy camaraderie that only comes from years of friendship. It was getting late, and the fire was starting to die down when we heard it. A sound from the woods, beyond the circle of firelight. It was a low, guttural growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I could see in Sarah and Josh's eyes that they'd heard it too. We fell silent, listening intently. The growl didn't come again, and after a few minutes, we started to convince ourselves that it was just a bear, or maybe coyote. Still, a sense of unease settled over our little campsite, a feeling that we were no longer alone in the woods. We decided to call it a night soon after, each of us retreating to our tents. Lying in my sleeping bag, I stared up at the canvas, listening to the sounds of the forest. The normal night sounds were still there, but now they seemed different, somehow amplified, and tinged with a subtle, underlying menace. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and as I drifted in and out of consciousness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness, something that was definitely not a bear or a coyote. The next morning, the unease from the previous night felt like a distant dream. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the forest seemed to have shed its nighttime menace. We emerged from our tents, blinking in the bright morning light, and started making breakfast. Probably just my imagination, I said, trying to sound nonchalant as I poured coffee. You know how it is in the woods at night. Every little sound gets amplified. Sarah nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. Maybe, she said. But that growl, it really didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. Josh, ever practical, shrugged. Could have been anything. Mountain lion, maybe. Or even a boar. They can make some pretty weird noises. He busied himself flipping pancakes, the smell of maple syrup filling the air. We spent the morning hiking along the little river trail. The scenery was breathtaking. The river rushed and tumbled over moss-covered rocks. Sunlight dappled through the trees, and the air was fresh and clean. We hiked for hours, enjoying the beauty of the Smokies, and gradually, the unsettling feeling from the previous night began to fade. By afternoon, we were back at the campsite, tired but invigorated. We decided to explore the old Elkmont ghost town, just a short walk from the campground. Elkmont was once a logging town and later a resort community, but it was abandoned after the national park was established. Now, the old buildings stood as silent, decaying reminders of a bygone era. We wandered through the deserted streets, peering into the empty cabins in the old Appalachian clubhouse. The silence was eerie, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the whisper of wind through broken windows. There was a strange atmosphere about the place, a sense of lingering history and forgotten lives. Sarah, who was fascinated by ghost stories, was in her element. She told us tales of the town's past, of loggers and wealthy families who once vacationed here, and of rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences. Even Josh, usually skeptical, seemed a little unnerved by the atmosphere. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows in the ghost town grew longer and darker. A chill wind began to rustle through the trees, and the sky overhead turned a heavy, ominous gray. It felt like a storm was brewing. We decided to head back to the campsite. As we walked, the wind picked up, whipping through the trees and carrying with it a low, moaning sound. The temperature dropped sharply, and the forest seemed to grow darker and more menacing with each step. Back at the campsite, we hurried to secure our tents and gather firewood before the storm hit. The wind howled through the trees, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. We huddled under the small tarp we'd strung up, watching as the sky opened up and the rain poured down in sheets. The storm raged for hours. The wind shrieked, the rain hammered against the tarp, and thunder echoed through the mountains. The fire, which we'd struggled to keep going, finally succumbed to the deluge, leaving us in near darkness. And then above the roar of the storm we heard it again, the growl. But this time it was closer, much closer. It seemed to be just beyond the edge of our campsite, in the thick darkness of the storm-lashed woods. It wasn't just a growl this time. It was accompanied by other sounds, heavy footsteps, crashing through the undergrowth, branches snapping else, a wet, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled through the mud and leaves. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped me. This was something animal different, something wrong. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Josh, his face pale in the flickering light of our lanterns, just shook his head, his usual bravado completely gone. The sounds circled our campsite, getting closer and closer. The growling intensified, becoming more guttural, more animalistic, yet somehow also intelligent, like whatever was out there was toying with us, enjoying our fear. Then, the dragging sound stopped right at the edge of the firelight. We held our breath, straining our eyes to see into the darkness, our hearts pounding in our chests. And then we saw it. Or rather, we saw them. Two figures, just beyond the reach of the rain, standing at the edge of the woods. They were tall and gaunt, their forms vaguely humanoid, but twisted and distorted. Their skin was pale and slick, glistening in the rain, and their eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent light. They stood there, motionless, watching us. And then, one of them raised a hand, long and skeletal, with claws instead of fingernails. It pointed directly at our campsite, and then it opened its mouth, and from its throat came a sound that was not a growl, not an animal sound at all. It was a whisper. A wet, rasping whisper that carried on the wind, cutting through the storm. And though we couldn't make out the words, we understood the intent. It was hunting us, and it was inviting us to play. The whisper hung in the air, chilling us to the bone. We were paralyzed by fear, staring at the two figures at the edge of the woods. The rain continued to lash down, blurring our vision, but there was no mistaking what we were seeing. These were not animals. These were something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent that had been lurking in the shadows of the Smokies. Josh was the first to break the spell. He scrambled backwards, bumping into the fire pit, sending embers scattering in the rain. "Run," he yelled, his voice hoarse with terror. "Just run." Without hesitation, we turned and fled. We didn't know where we were going, didn't have a plan, only the primal instinct to escape. We plunged into the darkness, away from the campsite, away from the glowing eyes and the whispering figures. The forest was a chaotic blur of trees and shadows in the storm. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tripped us, and the rain plastered our hair to our foreheads, stinging our eyes. We stumbled blindly through the undergrowth, the sounds of the storm and our own ragged breaths filling our ears. Behind us, we could hear them. The heavy footsteps, the snapping branches, the wet dragging sound growing closer. They were pursuing us relentlessly, effortlessly. We were no match for them in this terrain, in this storm. We were prey, and they were hunting us. We ran for what felt like hours, our lungs burning, our legs aching. We didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. We just driven by pure, unadulterated terror. Eventually, we burst out of the trees and into a clearing. Ahead through the rain, we could see the faint glow of lights. The campground. Salvation. We stumbled towards the lights, our pace quickening as hope surged through us. We could hear other campers now, distant voices muffled by the storm. Civilization. Safety. As we reached the edge of the campground, we glanced back. half expecting to see the figures emerge from the trees behind us. But the woods were dark and silent, swallowed by the storm. They weren't there. Or at least we couldn't see them. We didn't stop running until we reached the relative safety of the campground road. Other campers, huddled under their awnings, stared at us as we stumbled past, soaked to the bone, mud splattered, and gasping for breath. We must have looked like we'd seen a ghost. We didn't stop until we reached the campground restrooms, a solid concrete building that felt like a fortress compared to the flimsy tents we'd left behind. We collapsed inside, shivering and shaking, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving behind a hollow, aching fear. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the restrooms, unable to speak, unable to sleep. The storm raged on outside, but the sounds of the forest no longer seemed quite so menacing within the concrete walls. But the image of those figures, those glowing eyes, those whispering voices, were burned into our minds. As dawn finally broke, the storm began to subside. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the wind died down to a sigh. We emerged from the restrooms, blinking in the pale morning light, and looked back towards the woods. The forest was still there, silent and indifferent, concealing its secrets behind a veil of mist. It looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light, but we knew better. We knew what lurked within its depths. We packed up our campsite in a daze, moving like automatons. We didn't speak, didn't look at each other. We just wanted to get out of there, to leave the Smokies behind and never look back. We drove away from Elkmont in silence, the rising sun casting long shadows behind us. The beautiful scenery that had charmed us just days before now seemed ominous, tainted by the horror of the night. We never spoke of what we saw that night, not really. We tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as some kind of hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, we knew the truth. We had encountered something real, something ancient and terrifying. Something that dwells in the hidden places of the world. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I still hear that whisper in the darkness inviting me to play. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that it's still out there, waiting in the woods, waiting for us to come back. My name is Alex, and I've always been a city person. Concrete jungles, traffic noise, and the constant hum of electricity, that's my comfort zone. Nature, trees, wildlife. Appreciated from afar, preferably through a screen. But my best friend, Chris, is the opposite. He practically breathes fresh air and considers a weekend without hiking a weekend wasted. So, when Chris suggested a camping trip to Yellowstone National Park, I hesitated, a lot. "Come on, Alex," he'd said, his eyes shining with outdoorsy enthusiasm I could never quite understand. "Yellowstone, geysers, hot springs, wildlife, it'll be epic?" Epic was not the word that came to my mind. Terrifying, maybe. Beers, definitely. But Chris is persistent. And after weeks of relentless persuasion, I caved. Plus, he promised to handle all the nature stuff, which in my book meant setting up the tent and dealing with bugs. My only job was to show up and try not to get eaten by a wild animal. So here I am, standing at the edge of a sprawling pine forest in Yellowstone National Park. The air is crisp and smells piney. Okay, I'll admit, it's kind of nice. Chris is currently wrestling with the tent poles, muttering about idiot-proof instructions that are clearly not idiot-proof. Sunlight filters through the trees, dappling the forest floor in golden light. It actually looks peaceful. All right, tense up. Chris announces triumphantly, wiping sweat from his brow. First hurdle cleared. Now, let's find a good spot for the fire pit. He gestures towards a designated fire ring a few yards away. As we start gathering firewood, a sudden rustling in the bushes nearby makes me jump. Relax, it's probably just a squirrel. Chris chuckles, but his eyes scan the trees anyway. Even he, the nature enthusiast, seems a little on edge. The sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The forest is getting darker, and the temperature is dropping rapidly. We've got a fire going now, crackling merrily, casting flickering shadows that dance around us. Chris is humming some campfire song, and I'm trying to convince myself that this isn't so bad, maybe even enjoyable. Then a sound cuts through the peaceful crackle of the fire, a howl. Long, mournful, and chillingly close. It's not like any dog howl I've ever heard. This is wilder, deeper, and laced with something else. Chris stops humming, his cheerful demeanor vanishing instantly. He stares into the darkness beyond the firelight, his face pale. Coyote, I whisper, trying to sound casual even though my heart is pounding. Chris shakes his head slowly. That's not a coyote. The howl echoes again, closer this time. And this time, I hear something else mixed in with it. A low, guttural growl. Something big, something hungry. We both stare into the darkness, the firelight suddenly feeling very small, very fragile against the vast, unknown wilderness of Yellowstone. And for the first time, a cold dread creeps into my city-bred bones. Maybe, I pick, wasn't the right word for this trip after all. Maybe survival is more like it. The fire crackled, the only sound brave enough to challenge the deepening silence after that howl. Chris grabbed a thick branch from our wood pile, holding it like a makeshift spear. I, on the other hand, just froze, my eyes darting nervously into the inky blackness beyond the firelight. Beer. I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. Chris still looked pale, but he was trying to regain his composure. Beers grunt, they don't howl like that. And that growl, it was low, Alex. Too low for a coyote. Too wrong. He edged closer to the tree-line branch held out in front of him. Hello, he called out, his voice wavering slightly despite his attempt at bravado. Is anyone there? Silence. Only the snapping of the fire answered him. We waited, hearts pounding in our chests, for what felt like an eternity. Nothing. Maybe it was just far away. I offered weakly, desperately wanting to believe it. Chris lowered the branch slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the woods. Maybe, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Still, that was weird. And we stayed like that for a while, huddled around the fire, jumping at every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. The playful shadows cast by the flames now seemed menacing, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous figures in the periphery. The forest, which had seemed peaceful just moments ago, now felt actively hostile, like it was watching us with unseen eyes. Eventually, the silence stretched on, unbroken. The fire began to die down, embers glowing like malevolent eyes in the darkness. Chris, ever the pragmatist, decided we needed to try and sleep. We're probably just spooked, he said, though he still sounded uneasy. Animals make weird noises in the woods. We're safe in the tent. Just keep your headlamp handy, okay? Headlamp won't help if something decides to rip through the tent. I muttered, but I grabbed my headlamp anyway. Crawling into the tent felt like entering a flimsy cocoon of false security. The nylon walls seemed paper, thin, offering no real protection against whatever was out there. We lay side by side in our sleeping bags, listening intently. The forest was no longer silent. Now it was filled with subtle sounds. The whisper of wind through the pines, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and something else. A soft padding sound, like something moving just beyond the edge of our campsite. Too heavy for a squirrel, too deliberate for a deer. It circled us slowly, rhythmically, just out of sight. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice trembling. Yeah, Chris breathed back, equally tense. Just stay quiet. Maybe it'll go away. We held our breath, straining to hear over the frantic thumping of our own hearts. The padding sound continued its slow, methodical circle. Then it stopped. Silence descended again, heavier and more oppressive than before. Just when I thought I could finally exhale, a new sound pierced the stillness. A low, wet sniffing right outside the tent wall. It was close. Too close. I could practically feel the presence of whatever was making that sound, just inches away from us. My breath hitched in my throat. I could feel Chris stiffen beside me. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We were frozen, trapped in our flimsy tent, listening to something unknown sniffing around us in the darkness. The sniffing continued for what felt like an eternity then, just as suddenly as it stopped. Silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was charged, expectant, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it. A new sound, distinct from the padding and the sniffing. A soft scratching on the tent wall, right by my head, like claws, gently, tentatively testing the fabric. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a curious animal. This was deliberate. This was something investigating us. Something that knew we were here, inside this thin nylon shell. The scratching stopped. And then a new sound, the most terrifying sound of all. A whisper right outside the tent. So low I almost didn't catch it. But I did, and the words, though barely audible, chilled me to the bone. Are you scared? The voice raspy, guttural, not quite human, not quite animal. It was something in between, something wrong. And it was right outside our tent, waiting. Are you scared? The whisper hung in the air, a chilling question that didn't need an answer. My breath hitched, trapped somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Beside me, Chris was a statue, rigid and unmoving. We were both paralyzed, not just by fear, but by the sheer unnaturalness of it. Animals didn't talk. Animals didn't whisper. Animals didn't ask if you were scared. The silence stretched again, thick and suffocating. Then the scratching returned, more insistent this time, like claws testing the strength of the tent fabric. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could disappear, wishing I was back in my city apartment, surrounded by the comforting drone of traffic. Suddenly, Chris moved. Not violently, but deliberately. He reached slowly for his backpack, fumbling for something inside. My eyes snapped open. What was he doing? Was he crazy? Did he think fighting back was an option against whatever that was? He pulled out his headlamp, switched it on, and then, with a deep breath that sounded shaky even to my own ears, he unzipped the tent flap. Chris, no, I hissed, grabbing his arm, but he shook me off gently. We can't just sit here and wait. He whispered back, his voice tight with fear, but surprisingly firm. We need to see what it is. He was right. Staying in the tent was just prolonging the terror. At least facing it, even if it was the stupidest thing we could do, felt like taking back some control. He unzipped the flap fully and shone the headlamp into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the immediate campsite. Empty. Just the fire pit, our scattered firewood, and the trees looming at the edge of the light. Hello. Chris called out again, his voice stronger this time, laced with a desperate kind of defiance. Show yourself. Silence. Then a rustle in the trees to our left. Chris swung the headlamp towards the sound. Nothing. Just shadows dancing among the pines. It's gone. I breathed, relief washing over me in a dizzying wave. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. Chris didn't answer. He kept the headlamp trained on the woods, slowly panning it across the tree lane. And then he stopped, the beam fixed on something just beyond the firelight. My eyes followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing. Just more trees, more shadows. Then I saw them. 2 points of light reflecting back at us from the darkness eyes. Large, luminous, and burning with an unnatural intensity. They weren't animal eyes. They were too bright, too focused, too intelligent, and they were watching us, waiting. Chris slowly raised the branch again, pointing it towards the eyes. What are you? He demanded, his voice trembling slightly, but still holding its ground. What do you want? The eyes didn't move. They just stared, unwavering, burning holes into the darkness. Then a slow, deliberate step. And another. Whatever was out there was moving closer, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form still obscured by the darkness beyond the firelight. But as it stepped further into the clearing, I started to make out shapes. Long limbs, too thin, too angular. A hunched posture like something ancient and weary. And then the head. Not animal, not human, but something in between, elongated and grotesque, with those burning eyes fixed on us. It stepped fully into the firelight, and I finally saw it in its entirety. It was humanoid, but twisted wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp bones. Its limbs were too long, ending in clawed hands that scraped against the ground as it moved. And its face, it was vaguely human in shape, but the features were distorted, pulled into a grotesque parody of a face. And those eyes, they were the worst part. Burning with a cold, predatory light, it stood there, silent, watching us. Then it spoke the same raspy whisper from before, but louder now, clearer. You are in my woods. Its voice sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air. This wasn't an animal defending its territory. This was something else. Something that considered these woods its own, in a way that went beyond simple ownership. Chris, bless his nature, loving heart, still tried to reason with it. We didn't mean any harm. He stammered, branch still held out defensively. We're just camping. We'll leave in the morning. The creature tilted its head, those burning eyes never leaving us. Leave. It whispered, the word drawn out like it was tasting the sound of it. No, you are here now. It took another step closer. and I could see its mouth, a lipless gash filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. A low growl rumbled from its chest, deeper and more menacing than before. This wasn't about territory. This wasn't about fear. This was about something else, something hungry. Something that saw us not as intruders, but as prey. And in that moment, staring into those burning eyes, I understood. There were no rules of camping that could save us here. No bear spray, no loud noises, no handing food bags. We had stumbled into something ancient, something wild, something that played by rules we didn't understand. Rules of the wild, older and darker than any we could imagine. And we were about to learn them the hard way. The creature took another step, and the fire crackled again, a final, desperate burst of light against the encroaching darkness. And then the darkness moved. Hey Reddit, long-time lurker, first-time poster. Figured I'd finally share this story since it still freaks me out to this day. It happened last summer. Me and my buddies, we planned a camping trip to Yellowstone. We're all in our early 20s, college was finally done, and we wanted to celebrate with some time in the great outdoors. There was me, Mark, the planner of the group, always making spreadsheets and double checking reservations. Then there's Chris, my roommate, the comedian, always cracking jokes even when they weren't landing. And lastly, Sarah, Chris's girlfriend, who is probably the most level-headed person I know, and definitely the most outdoorsy of us all. We picked Yellowstone because, well, it's Yellowstone. Geysers, hot springs, wildlife, the whole package. Sarah had been before with her family and swore it was incredible. We booked a campsite near the Firehole River. Seemed like a good central location to explore from. The drive up was pretty uneventful, just hours of highway and bad gas station coffee. We arrived late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the pine trees. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth, that classic mountain smell. We found our campsite easily enough. It was decent, a fire pit, a picnic table, and enough space for our 2 tents. We quickly got to work setting up. Chris, of course, supervised while Sarah and I wrestled with the tent poles. Once the tents were up, we started gathering firewood. Anyone else feeling watched? Chris asked, glancing around the trees. A twig he'd picked up, pretending to be a rifle. Relax, drama queen. Sarah chuckled, hoisting a log twice the size of Chris's twig. It's just the woods. Animals probably checking us out. I shrugged. Probably just bears wanting our snacks. I joked, trying to lighten the slightly uneasy feeling I was starting to get myself. We got a decent fire going as darkness really settled in. We cooked up some burgers and swapped stories, mostly reminiscing about college and joking about future plans. The fire crackled. The stars were starting to pop out above the trees, and for a while everything felt perfect. Just us, the wilderness, and a weekend of freedom. It wasn't until later, when we were huddled around the dying embers of the fire, that things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a prickle on the back of my neck. But then it got stronger, like we weren't alone anymore. It started with sounds, just little things at first. A twig snapping in the woods beyond the firelight. An animal rustling in the underbrush. Normal camping noises, right? But they seemed closer than they should be, and they kept happening even when we were being quiet. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, poking the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying upwards. Chris, who had been mid-joke, stopped and listened. Yeah, something's out there. He lowered his voice, suddenly less jokey. Probably just a deer or something. I strained my ears trying to pinpoint the sounds. It wasn't just one thing. It was like movement. Around us. In the darkness just beyond the reach of the fire. Maybe we should put some more wood on, I suggested, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. We piled more logs onto the fire, the flames leaping higher, pushing back the darkness a little. The fire crackled and popped, and for a few minutes, the sounds from the woods seemed to recede. Then we heard it, not just a rustle or a snap. This was different. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, like someone was walking just outside the circle of firelight. And it was getting closer. We all froze, staring into the darkness, the flames dancing in our eyes. The crunching stopped. Silence. Just the crackling fire and the sound of our own breathing. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. Is anyone there? Silence. Chris grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it out like a torch. Maybe it's another camper wandered off trail, he said, but his voice was shaky. Sarah shook her head slowly. Campsites are pretty spread out here, Mark, and everyone's supposed to stay on marked trails after dark. The crunching started again. Closer this time. Definitely closer. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy. Like someone was taking their time, not trying to be quiet at all. Chris took a step forward, the burning branch casting flickering shadows in the trees. Who's there? Show yourself. The crunching stopped again. But this time the silence felt different. It felt thick. Heavy, like something was holding its breath, listening to us. Then a new sound. A soft, almost whispery sound, like breathing. Heavy breathing. Right at the edge of the firelight. We all held our breath, staring into the darkness, our hearts pounding in our chests. The fire crackled. The stars glittered above and we waited. Listened. For whatever was out there just beyond the light. The breathing was ragged, wet-sounding, like something was struggling to breathe. It was so close now we could almost feel it. The air grew heavy, charged with something we couldn't name but could definitely feel. Fear. Primal, gut-wrenching fear. Slowly, hesitantly, a figure stepped into the edge of the firelight. At first, it was just a shape distorted by the flickering flames and shadows. Tall. Too tall. And gaunt. Unnaturally thin. As it moved fully into the light, we could see it. It was a man. Sort of human-shaped anyway. But wrong. Terribly wrong. He was dressed in tattered clothes, ripped and stained, like he'd been wandering in the woods for weeks. His hair was long, matted, and greasy, hanging down past his shoulders, obscuring most of his face. But it was his skin that really got to me. It was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. Veins showed blue and prominent beneath the surface, like a roadmap of something dead. His eyes were the worst. When he finally lifted his head and the firelight caught his face, I saw them. Black. Completely black. No whites, no pupils, just two empty black sockets staring at us. And they were fixed on us, unblinking hungry. He opened his mouth and a rasping sound came out like rocks grinding together, not words. Not even close to words. Just a guttural, inhuman noise. Chris, bless his idiotic bravery, stepped forward again, still holding the burning branch. You okay, man? Need help. He was trying to sound normal, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The figure didn't respond to Chris's words. It just kept staring, those black eyes fixed on us. Then, slowly, deliberately, it started to move again. Towards us, it shuffled forward, one slow, dragging step at a time. Each step was accompanied by that crunching sound, even on the soft pine needle duff of our campsite. It was like he was dragging something heavy with him. Something unseen. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. I could feel her trembling. I was trembling too. Chris was still holding the burning branch out, but his hand was shaking so badly the flames were flickering wildly. We should go. Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Go where? I didn't know anywhere was better than here, but we started to back away slowly, keeping our eyes fixed on the figure. It kept coming, that slow, relentless shuffle. The breathing was louder now, closer. We could smell him now, too. A cloying, sickly sweet smell like rotting meat and damp earth. We stumbled backwards, away from the fire, into the darkness of the trees. We didn't run, couldn't run. We were frozen, paralyzed by fear, backing away step by agonizing step as the figure shuffled closer and closer, the black holes of its eyes burning into us. We kept backing away, further and further into the woods, the firelight shrinking behind us until it was just a tiny orange glow in the distance. And still, we could hear it, the crunching, coming after us, into the dark. We didn't stop running until we reached the park road, miles from our campsite, hours later, just as the first hint of dawn was starting to lighten the eastern sky. We flagged down a ranger patrol, babbling about a stranger, about the woods, about the feeling of being watched. They listened, their faces grim, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Probably just a bear, folks. Or maybe you just spooked yourselves. Maybe. But I know what we saw, what we felt. And I know we weren't alone out there. Not at all. We never went back to that campsite. Never went camping again, actually. And to this day, whenever I'm in the woods, I still get that feeling. That prickle on the back of my neck. Like something is watching, waiting. just beyond the edge of the light. That's my story. So yeah, don't go camping in Yellowstone, maybe. Or if you do, just be careful who you invite to your campfire, even if you don't realize you invited them at all. My name is Alex, and I guess you could say I'm a bit of a sucker for the outdoors. When my friends suggested a camping trip to Acadia National Park for spring break, I was the first to say yes. I mean, who wouldn't want to spend a week surrounded by granite peaks, crashing waves, and evergreen forests? Plus, Acadia is supposed to have some of the darkest night skies on the East Coast. I was picturing nights filled with stargazing and campfire stories. There were four of us going: me, my roommate Ben, and our friends Sarah and Emily. Ben is the planner of the group, always meticulously organizing everything from gear lists to trail maps. Sarah is the adventurous one, always pushing us to try new things, whether it's cliff jumping or backcountry skiing. Emily as well. Emily is Emily. She's a bit quieter than Sarah and me, more into books and photography, but she's always up for an adventure as long as there's coffee involved. We drove up to Maine in Ben's Subaru, which was packed to the brim with tents, sleeping bags, backpacks, and enough trail mix to feed a small army. The drive itself was beautiful, especially as we got closer to the coast. The air smelled like pine and salt, and the views were incredible. We arrived at Acadia in the late afternoon and set up camp at Blackwoods Campground. It was already starting to get chilly, but the sun was still shining, filtering through the tall trees. "This is awesome," Sarah said, breathing in deeply as she stretched after the long drive. "I can already tell this is going to be an epic trip." Emily nodded, already snapping photos with her camera. "The light is perfect right now." Ben, ever practical, was unpacking the car. "All right, let's get organized. I've got the tent locations marked on the map. Alex, you and I will take Site A, Sarah and Emily. You're in B." We quickly set up our tents and started gathering firewood. The campground was pretty empty this early in the season, which was actually kind of nice. It felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves. As dusk began to settle, we got a fire going, the flames crackling and spitting as they devoured the dry wood. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, telling stories and laughing as the sky deepened to a velvety black. Later, as we sat around the dying embers, Sarah pulled out her phone. "Did you guys know Acadia is supposed to be haunted?" she said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Ben rolled his eyes. "Here we go." "Seriously?" Sarah insisted, pulling up a webpage. "Listen to this. Acadia National Park is known for its stunning beauty, but also for its eerie history. From ghostly shipwrecks off the coast to unexplained disappearances in the dense woods, Acadia has more than its fair share of spooky tales." She read on, recounting local legends of phantom hikers and strange lights seen flickering in the forests at night. Emily shivered dramatically, pulling her sweater tighter around her. "Okay, maybe we should stick to stargazing," she said, but I could tell she was secretly intrigued. I just laughed. "Come on, guys, it's just campfire stories." "But hey," I added, glancing around at the dark woods surrounding our campsite, "keeps things interesting, right?" Little did I know how right I would be. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of the ocean, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in those woods. And it wasn't just squirrels and raccoons I was worried about. There was something else out there, something unsettling. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified in the darkness. I kept imagining those phantom hikers Sarah had read about, silently watching us from the shadows of the trees. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off, but my sleep was fitful, filled with strange, unsettling dreams. I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. Ben, ever the early riser, was already up and cooking breakfast over the campfire. The sun was just beginning to peek through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. The air was crisp and cold, but the promise of a new day was in the air. "Sleepyhead," Ben said, handing me a mug of coffee. "You look like you didn't get much sleep." "Yeah, not really," I admitted, taking a grateful sip of the hot coffee. "Just weird dreams." Sarah and Emily emerged from their tenryong and stretching. "Smells amazing, Ben," Sarah said, grabbing a plate of bacon. "So," Emily said after a few bites, Anyone hear anything weird last night? She glanced around the campsite, her eyes a little wider than usual. Sarah and I exchanged a look. Weird how? Sarah asked, playing it cool, but I could tell she was thinking about the ghost stories too. I don't know, Emily said, shrugging. Just noises. Like footsteps, maybe, outside the tent, Ben snorted. Probably just animals, squirrels, raccoons, deer. This is the woods, remember? Yeah, maybe, Emily said, unconvinced. We finished breakfast and started packing up for a day hike. Ben had planned a route up Cadillac Mountain, the highest point in Acadia, for panoramic views of the park and the ocean. As we laced up our hiking boots, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily wasn't the only one who had heard something strange the night before. I had a nagging feeling myself, a sense of unease that went beyond just campfire-induced jitters. The hike up Cadillac was challenging but beautiful. The trail wound through forests of pine and birch, opening up to stunning views of Frenchman Bay and the Porcupine Islands. We scrambled over granite ledges and passed by crystal clear streams. The higher we climbed, the more expansive the view became. By the time we reached the summit, we were all a little breathless, but the vista was worth it. We spent an hour at the top, taking photos and soaking in the scenery. The wind whipped around us, carrying the scent of pine and the distant cry of seagulls. From up there, Acadia stretched out before us in all its wild beauty, a tapestry of green forests, blue ocean, and gray rock. It was breathtaking, but even in the bright sunshine, a sliver of unease lingered in the back of my mind. As we started our descent, Sarah, who was in the lead, suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice hushed. "Do you guys hear that?" We all froze, listening. At first, there was only the sound of the wind and the rustling trees. Then I heard it. A faint sound carried on the breeze. A rhythmic, scraping sound, like "Is that digging?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide again. Ben frowned, tilting his head. Digging. What would be digging up here? We started walking again, slowly, cautiously, following the trail. The scraping sound grew louder, clearer. It was definitely digging, a steady, rhythmic scrape against earth and rock. And it was coming from just off the trail, deeper in the woods. Sarah, ever the adventurous one, started to veer off the path. "Let's check it out," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Sarah, maybe we should stick to the trail," Ben said, sounding a little nervous for once. "Come on, Ben, don't be such a scaredy cat," Sarah teased, but she hesitated, glancing back at us. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. The woods around us suddenly seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The scraping sound was insistent, relentless, and undeniably unnatural. Maybe we should just go back to camp," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at Ben, then at Sarah, then into the darkening woods. The scraping sound continued, closer now, it seemed, and for the first time, a real, cold fear began to creep into my heart. Something was out there in the woods, and I had a feeling it wasn't just digging a hole. A shiver ran down my spine. "Yeah, maybe Emily's right," I said, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. "Let's just head back." Sarah hesitated for another moment, her adventurous spirit clearly battling with a newfound sense of unease. But the persistent, unsettling scrape of digging seemed to tip the scales. "Okay," she said finally, turning back towards the trail. "Camp sounds good." We started walking quickly, almost jogging back down the path. The scraping sound, however, didn't fade. It seemed to follow us, echoing through the trees, always just out of sight. We didn't talk. Each of us lost in our own thoughts, the silence broken only by our hurried footsteps and the relentless digging. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps approaching. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just the deepening shadows and the constant, rhythmic scrape. We practically stumbled back into our campsite, the familiar sight of our tents and the dying embers of the fire a welcome relief. But even the relative safety of the campsite, the unease lingered. The digging sound was still there, fainter now, but still audible, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods surrounding the campground. "Okay," Ben said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice was tight. "Definitely animals. Probably just a bear digging for roots or something." "Bears don't dig like that," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. That's too rhythmic, too deliberate. Sarah was pacing around the campsite, her brow furrowed. I don't like this, she said. I really don't like this. Then let's pack up. I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Let's just leave. Now, Ben looked at me, surprised. Leave? But we just got here, and we haven't even hiked half the trails I planned. I don't care about the trails, Ben, I said, my voice rising. I just want to get out of these woods. Something's not right here. Emily and Sarah nodded in agreement. Even Sarah, the most adventurous of us, looked genuinely scared. Ben looked at our faces, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed to waver. He was a planner, a rational thinker, but even he couldn't deny the palpable sense of dread that had settled over our camp. All right, he said, finally sighing. All right, we'll pack up, but we're doing it in the morning. It's almost dark, and I'm not packing up camp in the dark because of some noises. I wanted to argue, to insist on leaving right then and there, but I knew Ben was right about one thing. Packing up camp in the dark would be a nightmare. And maybe, just maybe, it was just animals. Maybe we're all just being paranoid, letting Sarah's ghost stories get to us. Okay, I said, reluctantly. Morning. First light. We ate a quick, silent dinner, the campfire casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in the darkness. The digging sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was even more unsettling. It felt heavy, expectant, like something was holding its breath, waiting. As darkness fell completely, we retreated to our tents. Sleep was even more elusive than the night before. Every creak of the tent fabric, every sigh of the wind, made me jump. I lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it again, faint at first but unmistakable. The scraping, digging, closer now. Much closer. It was right outside the campsite, just beyond the circle of dying embers. I held my breath, listening intently. The digging grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't rhythmic anymore. It was ragged, desperate, punctuated by sharp, cracking sounds like bone against stone. And then I heard another sound, a low, guttural growl rising from the darkness, a sound that was not animal, not human, but something ancient and hungry and utterly terrifying. I scrambled for my phone, fumbling in the dark, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I had to wake Ben, Sarah, Emily. We had to get out of here. But as I fumbled with the power button, trying to turn on the screen, the tent fabric beside my head ripped open with a tearing sound. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Something was right outside my tent, something big, something close, and then I saw it. A hand. Not a human hand. Long skeletal fingers tipped with claws like obsidian shards. Pale. Bone. White skin stretched tight over protruding knuckles. It reached through the ripped fabric, grasping, searching. The scariest thing about camp. It's not the ghost stories. It's not the dark woods or the strange noises. It's the realization that sometimes the stories are real. And sometimes what's digging in the woods isn't looking for roots. It's looking for you. My name is Alex and my sister Sarah, and I just arrived in Yosemite National Park. We're here for the summer, staying at our grandparents' old house just outside the park's main valley. Grandma and Grandpa moved to Florida years ago, but they kept the house, saying it was important to hold on to our family history. Honestly, I think they just couldn't bear to part with it. It's been empty for years, and Sarah and I drew the short straw, or rather volunteered, naively thinking it would be an adventure to come up here and get it ready to sell. The drive up here was beautiful, I'll give it that. Yosemite is breathtaking. Towering granite cliffs, giant sequoia trees that look like they touch the sky, and this crisp, clean air that smells like pine and something else who's something welder. But as we got closer to the house, the feeling shifted. The towering trees seemed less majestic and more watching. The air got colder, even though it's July. We finally turned onto the long, winding driveway leading to the house. It's much more secluded than I remembered from childhood visits. The trees are thicker here, almost blocking out the sunlight, and the air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sarah, who's usually glued to her phone, actually put it down and stared out the window, a rare sight. This place is creepy, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Don't be dramatic, I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. But even I had to admit, the house looming at the end of the driveway looked less like a welcoming family home and more like something out of a horror movie. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the windows were dark and empty, like eyes staring out from the shadows. A shiver ran down my spine, and I suddenly wished we'd chosen Florida instead. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Dust lay thick on everything, and the air was stale and musty. It smelled old, not just in a vintage way, but like something had been decaying here for a long time. We opened windows to air it out, but the heavy, damp smell just seemed to cling to the walls. Sarah and I started to explore, room by room. The living room was filled with heavy, dark furniture covered in sheets. The kitchen was surprisingly modern. Grandma had renovated it years ago, but even the stainless steel appliances looked grimy and neglected now. Upstairs, the bedrooms were small and cramped, with sloping ceilings and unsettling shadows in the corners. My grandparents' bedroom was the creepiest. It was at the end of the hall, overlooking the woods behind the house. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, patterned with these weird, swirling shapes that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. And there was this heavy, oppressive feeling in the room, like the air itself was pressing down on you. Sarah refused to go inside. "I'm not setting foot in there," she declared from the hallway, her eyes wide. "Sat room, it feels wrong." I tried to tell her she was being ridiculous, but I didn't want to go in there alone either. Finally, we decided to tackle it together. We pushed the door open and stepped inside, bracing ourselves. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house, despite the summer heat outside. The bed was neatly made, but the sheets were yellowed with age. On the nightstand, there was a small, framed photo of Grandma and Grandpa when they were young, smiling and carefree. It felt strange to see them like that in this room, which felt so heavy and sad. Then I noticed something else on the nightstand, tucked behind the photo frame. It was a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. It looked old, older than the house itself. Curiosity overriding my unease, I reached out and picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. As my fingers closed around the box, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and I thought, just for a moment, I heard a faint whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves, coming from somewhere deep within the shadows of the room. Sarah gasped. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing at the wooden box in my hand. I shrugged, turning the box over in my fingers. The carvings were strange, swirling lines and sharp angles that didn't seem to form any recognizable pattern, yet they felt significant somehow. The wood itself was dark and smooth, almost like polished stone. "I don't know," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Found it on the nightstand. I tried to open it, but the lid was firmly shut. There was no latch, no hinges visible, just the seamless carved wood. I ran my fingers along the edges, searching for a way to open it. Maybe it's locked," Sarah suggested, still standing nervously in the doorway. "Doesn't look like it," I replied, applying a bit more pressure to the lid. Still nothing. It was as if the box was sealed shut, not by a lock, but by something elsey, something intentional. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to thicken, and the shadows in the corners deepened. The faint whisper I thought I'd heard before returned, louder this time, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to come from all around us. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Alex," she breathed, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is that sound?" The whispering grew louder, swirling around us, and the temperature in the room plummeted. We could see our breath misting in the air. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, and the swirling patterns on the wallpaper seemed to actually move now, like they were alive. Panic flared in my chest. Something was definitely wrong. This wasn't just an old, creepy house. There was something else here, something malevolent. "We need to get out of this room," I said, my voice tight with fear. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. We backed away from the nightstand, keeping our eyes fixed on the wooden box in my hand, and stumbled out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind us. We leaned against the closed door, panting, listening to the frantic thumping of our own hearts. The whispering stopped as soon as we left the room. The air in the hallway felt warmer, almost normal. But the oppressive feeling, the sense of dread, still lingered, clinging to us like the musty smell of the house. I looked down at the box in my hand. It was just a box, a small wooden box. But it felt heavy, not just in weight, but with something else as something dark and ancient. And I had a terrible feeling that whatever was inside, or connected to it, was now very much aware that we were here. We retreated downstairs, the wooden box still clutched in my hand. We sat in the living room on one of the sheet-covered sofas, trying to catch our breath and make sense of what had just happened. "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I have no idea," I admitted, turning the box over and over. "But I don't like it. I think it's what's making this house so creepy. Maybe we should just leave it," Sarah suggested, her eyes darting nervously towards the stairs. "Just put it back and pretend we never saw it." I hesitated. Part of me desperately wanted to do just that. To put the box back, leave the house, and never look back. But another part of me, the part that was always too curious for my own good, needed to know what was inside. "No," said finally, my voice firmer this time. "We can't. Not now. We need to know what this is." Sarah groaned. "Are you crazy? That thing is bad news. I can feel it." "Maybe," I said. "But maybe if we know what it is, we can get rid of it. Or at least understand what's going on." I looked at the box again, running my thumb over the strange carvings. There had to be a way to open it. I tried twisting the top, sliding the sides, even gently prying at the seam with my fingernail. Nothing worked. The box remained stubbornly sealed. Frustration mounting, I slammed the box down on the coffee table, and as I did, I heard a faint click. Sarah and I froze, staring at the box. Slowly, almost hesitantly, I reached out and touched the lid again. This time it moved. With a soft whisper-like sound, the lid slid open, revealing the dark interior of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small object. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but as I reached in and lifted it out, I saw what it was. It was a key. Not a modern key, but an old-fashioned one made of tarnished metal, with intricate carvings along its shaft that echoed the symbols on the box. It felt cold to the touch, colder even than the box itself. As I held the key, a wave of dizziness washed over me, and the whispering sound returned, louder than ever, swirling around us like a whirlwind. But this time it wasn't just whispering. This time I could almost make out words, faint and distorted, but words nonetheless. They seemed to be coming from the key itself, or perhaps from somewhere deeper within the house, carried on the chill air. And as the whispers grew stronger, coalescing into a chilling, sibilant murmur, I understood what they were saying. They were saying, "Open it." I looked at Sarah, her face pale with terror, her eyes fixed on the key in my hand. She shook her head slowly, pleadingly. "No, Alex, don't. Please don't." But the whispers were growing louder, more insistent, filling my head, drowning out Sarah's voice, drowning out my own fear. "Open it. Open it. Open it." My hand moved as if of its own accord, the key turning in my fingers. And then on the side of the wooden box, almost hidden amongst the swirling carvings, was a tiny keyhole, no bigger than the head of a pin. It was almost invisible, but now, with the key in my hand, it seemed to glow faintly, beckoning me closer. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a chorus of voices urging me on. "Open it. Open it now." My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of dread. But the curiosity, the need to know, was too strong to resist. Slowly, deliberately, I raised the key and inserted into the tiny keyhole. There was a soft click, and the box sprang open, and then darkness. It's funny the things that catch your attention, isn't it? Out of the millions of stories out there, the endless stream of news and noise, certain ones just stick. They burrow under your skin, a persistent itch in the back of your mind that you can't quite scratch. For me, it's always been the strange ones, the cases that don't quite add up, the whispers in the dark corners of the internet that hint at something else. My name's Alex, by the way. Just Alex. I've always been drawn to the unexplained, the mysteries that make your hairs stand on end. Maybe it's a morbid curiosity, or maybe it's just a need to understand the things that go bump in the night. Whatever it is, it led me here, to Yosemite National Park. Yosemite. Even the name sounds majestic, doesn't it? Towering granite cliffs that scrape the sky, waterfalls that plunge hundreds of feet, ancient sequoia trees that have stood for millennia. It's the kind of place that makes you feel small and significant in the face of something truly immense and powerful. And it is powerful. You can feel it in the air, in the silence that's so deep it almost hums. But there's another feeling too, a subtle undercurrent that runs beneath the postcard, perfect scenery, something watchful. I came to Yosemite for a break, a chance to disconnect and breathe in some fresh air. But as always, my mind started to wander, drawn to the shadows lurking just beyond the sunlight. I'd been reading about Yosemite before my trip, soaking up the guidebooks and hiking blogs, when I stumbled across them. 3 cases. 3 particular incidents in Yosemite's long history that just didn't sit right. They were all different, separated by years, seemingly unconnected. But something about them, some faint, unsettling thread pulled me in. There was the disappearance near Bridal Veal Fall, shrouded in mist and whispers of an old Miwok legend about an evil spirit named Po, who lures people to their doom. Then there was the strange account from a park ranger about finding a campsite abandoned, everything left behind, with no sign of struggle, just gone. And finally, the chilling story of the severed hands found in a meadow, with no bodies, no explanation, just hands. 3 particular cases, whose backstories compelled me to dig deeper. And now, standing here in Yosemite Valley, surrounded by the overwhelming grandeur of nature, I can't shake the feeling that I'm closer to something. Something hidden, something old, something waiting. The first case, the one that initially snagged my attention, was the disappearance near Bridal Veal Fall. It happened back in 1988. A young woman named Sarah Holloway, 22 years old, vanished without a trace while hiking alone near the falls. It was a sunny afternoon in July, peak season in Yosemite. The trail to Bridal Veal Fall is popular, usually bustling with tourists. Yet, no one saw anything. One minute Sarah was there, snapping photos of the cascading water, the next gone. The official report, of course, leaned towards accidental fall. Bridal Veal Fall is beautiful, but the rocks around it can be slippery, especially with the mist. They searched for days, park rangers, volunteers even searched dogs. Nothing. No body, no belongings, not even a stray hiking boot. It was as if she'd simply dissolved into the mist itself. But it was the local angle that really made the hairs on my neck prickle. Bridal Veal Fall, you see, has a Miwok named Po. No. And no isn't just a name for a waterfall. It's the name of a vengeful spirit in Miwok legend, a being said to lure people to their deaths with its beauty, then snatch them away into the mists. A spirit of the underworld hungry for souls. I found a few old articles online, local newspapers mostly, that mentioned the legend in passing, usually in a dismissive tone. Just local folklore, they'd say. Tragic accident, nothing more. But reading between the lines, I could sense a different current. Whispers in online forums, comments on old blog posts, people who lived in the area, or claimed to talking about Poe, who know with a hushed reverence, a genuine fear. They spoke of strange mists that weren't natural, of voices carried on the wind, of a feeling of being watched near the falls even on the brightest days. Skeptical, sure, but intrigued. Standing at the base of Bridal Veal Fall myself, now the air thick with spray, the roar of the water deafening, I could almost understand it. There is something otherworldly about this place. The mist swirls and dances, taking on shapes in the corner of your eye. The sunlight struggles to penetrate the dense spray, creating an ethereal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. It's beautiful, yes, but also unsettling, like the veil itself is thin here, and something could reach through. I spent hours at Bridal Veal Fall that day, watching the water, listening to the wind, trying to feel something. I didn't see any ghosts or hear any voices, but I did feel a sense of unease, a prickling awareness that I wasn't alone, even amidst the other tourists. And I kept thinking about Sarah Holloway vanishing into thin air, swallowed by the mist. Accident maybe, but po-ho. Nah, the legend lingered, a chilling possibility that refused to be dismissed that night. Back at my campsite, nestled amongst the towering pines, I started digging deeper into the second case, the abandoned campsite. And that one, in its own way, was even stranger than the vanishing woman at Bridal Veal Fall. The case of the abandoned campsite happened much more recently, just a few years ago in 2021. This one wasn't a disappearance, not exactly. No one vanished, at least not in the traditional sense. But what they left behind, or rather, how they left it, was profoundly disturbing. It was late autumn, October. The crowds in Yosemite had thinned out. The air was crisp and cool, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. A park ranger, doing a routine patrol of a less traveled area near the Merced River, stumbled upon it. Campsite number 12 in the Upper Pines campground. Normally, this campground is booked solid during peak season, but in October, it's much quieter. Campsite 12 was supposed to be empty that night, according to the reservation logs. But it wasn't. The tent was pitched, a sturdy-looking dumb tent, the kind serious campers use. A campfire ring was there, cold ashes scattered within, and scattered around the campsite everything else. Cooking gear, backpacks, sleeping bags, clothes, food containers, all the paraphernalia of a weekend camping trip. It was all just left, as if the occupants had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind. The ranger, a seasoned veteran named Ben Carter, told the local sheriff's department it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen in his 20 years in the park. He'd seen abandoned campsites before, sure. Sometimes people cut their trips short due to weather or injury, leaving behind a cheap tent or some forgotten supplies. But this was different. This was everything. Expensive gear, personal items, even car keys were found tucked into a backpack pocket. And there was no sign of struggle, no indication of foul play. Just abandonment. The campers were identified as a couple from San Francisco, Mark and Emily Chen, both in their early 30s. They were experienced hikers, known for their meticulous planning and love of the outdoors. Their car was still in the parking lot, right where they'd left it. Their phones, wallets, IDs, everything was in the tent. It was as if they had stepped out for a moment and simply never come back. A full-scale search was launched, of course. Again, park rangers, volunteer dogs. Search days turned into weeks. Nothing. No trace of Mark or Emily Chen. The campsite yielded no clues, no notes, no sign of what might have happened. The food in the containers was still fresh, suggesting they hadn't been gone long. The campfire was cold, but not rained out, indicating they'd left on a clear night. What could make two experienced campers abandon everything, walk away from their lives, and vanish into the wilderness without a word, bare attack? Unlikely, no signs of animal activity. Kidnapping in the middle of a busy campground, leaving all their possessions behind. Equally improbable. Accident. Possible, but again, why leave everything? The case baffled everyone. It went cold quickly. The Chens became another Yosemite mystery, a footnote in the park's long and sometimes unsettling history. But Ranger Carter, I read, was never quite the same after finding that campsite. He spoke of a feeling of wrongness, a sense that something unnatural had occurred there. He mentioned a silence in the woods that day, deeper than usual, a silence that felt hungry. Sitting by my own campfire now, the flames crackling and spitting, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, I can almost feel that silence myself. The normal sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the distant rush of the river seem muted tonight, as if something is holding its breath, listening. And I can't help but wonder, what did Mark and Emily Chen hear in that silence? What did they see that made them leave everything behind and run? Or were they taken? And if so, taken by what? Tomorrow I'm heading to the meadow to investigate the third case, the one about the severed hands. And somehow I have a feeling that's where things are going to get really strange. The meadow. Ah, the meadow. Even the word itself conjures up images of peace, tranquility, wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Yosemite has many meadows, pockets of open space nestled amongst the granite giants, offering breathtaking views and a sense of serene isolation. The one I was heading to was called El Capitan Meadow, known for its stunning vista of, you guessed it, El Capitan. But it's also known for something else, something far less idyllic. It's known for the hands. The story of the severed hands is the oldest of the three cases, dating back to 1975. It's also the most gruesome, the most overtly wrong. Unlike the other two, this one wasn't a disappearance or an abandonment. This was dismemberment. It was early spring May. The snowmelt was in full swing. The meadows were lush and green, bursting with new life. A group of hikers, venturing off trail in El Capitan Meadow, stumbled upon them. Two human hands, severed cleanly at the wrists, lying side by side in the grass as if carefully placed. No bodies were ever found. No other remains, no bloodstains, just the hands. They were male hands, identified later through dental records as belonging to a local man named David Miller, a nature photographer known for his landscape shots of Yosemite. He'd been reported missing a few weeks prior, after failing to return from a solo photography trip. The police investigation went nowhere. No witnesses, no suspects, no motive. Why just the hands? And why leave them so conspicuously in the middle of a meadow where they were almost certain to be found? It made no sense. Theories abounded, of course. Animal attack. Highly unlikely. Animals don't typically sever hands so cleanly and leave them untouched. Murder. Possible, but again, the hands alone. It was bizarre, theatrical almost, like some macabre message. The case of the severed hands became a local legend, a dark stain on Yosemite's pristine beauty. People whispered about cults, about ritual killings, about something inhuman. And El Capitan Meadow, once a popular spot for picnics and photography, gained a reputation. People started avoiding it, especially after dusk. They said the meadow felt tainted, that a coldness lingered there, even in the summer sun. Standing in El Capitan Meadow now, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass, I can feel it. A coldness. Not just the temperature, which is starting to drop as evening approaches, but a deeper coldness, an emptiness in the air, a sense of something missing, or perhaps something taken. I walked to the spot where the hands were found, according to the old newspaper articles I'd read. It's just grass now, ordinary meadow grass, indistinguishable from the rest. But as I stand there, looking around, I can't shake the feeling that something happened here, something terrible. The majestic view of El Capitan, usually so inspiring, feels almost mocking now, a silent witness to some unspeakable horror. And then I see it, just at the edge of the meadow, where the trees begin, something glinting in the fading light. I walk towards it, my heart starting to pound in my chest, its small metallic half buried in the leaves. I kneel down and brush away the debris. It's a camera, an old film camera, the kind David Miller would have used. Tarnished, weathered, but unmistakably a camera, and clutched tightly in the strap, tangled amongst the leather something else. Something bone, white. I carefully pull it free. It's small, finger-sized, perfectly smooth and white, like polished ivory, but it's not ivory, it's bone. A finger bone, a human finger bone. And as I stare at it, lying in the palm of my hand, a wave of icy dread washes over me. The three cases. Bridal Veal Fall, the abandoned campsite, the severed hands. They aren't separate incidents. They're connected. By something here in Yosemite. Something ancient, something hungry, something that takes pieces. Pieces of people. A woman swallowed by mist, a couple stripped bare of their lives. A photographer reduced toe hands. The sun dips below the horizon, plunging the meadow in a shadow. The air grows colder, the silence deeper, heavier. And I hear it then, a faint whisper on the wind, carried from the trees, from the rocks, from the very earth itself. A whisper that sounds like a Poe. Oh no. And I know with chilling certainty that I've dug too deep, that I've stumbled onto something I shouldn't have, that the itch in the back of my mind has led me to a place where answers are not meant to be found, and that in Yosemite, in this beautiful, terrifying place, some mysteries are best left undisturbed, before they reach out and take a piece of you too. My name is Alex, and I guess you could say I'm a sucker for adventure. That's probably why I ended up agreeing to this crazy roommate situation in the first place. When my buddy told me about a job opening at Yosemite National Park with employee housing, I jumped at the chance. Fresh air, stunning views, and a break from city life. Sign me up. The only catch was the roommate, a guy named Eddie. I didn't know Eddie before moving into the tiny cabin they gave us. He was already there when I arrived, unpacking a duffel bag that looked like it had seen better decades. Eddie was tall and lanky, with eyes that seemed to dart around even when he was talking to you. He had this nervous energy about him, like a hummingbird trapped in a jar. "Hey, you must be Alex," he said, extending a hand that was surprisingly cold. "I'm Eddie." "Nice to meet you, man," I replied, shaking his hand, excited to be here. Eddie just nodded, his gaze drifting towards the window overlooking the towering pines outside. "Yosemite's something else," he murmured more to himself than me. The cabin was basic, 2 twin beds, a small desk, and the scent of pine needles clinging to everything. Outside, though, was breathtaking, even from our little clearing. I could see the granite faces of El Capitan and Half Dome in the distance, bathed in the golden afternoon light. "We're going to have a blast here, Eddie," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. He turned back to me, a faint, almost unsettling smile playing on his lips. "Oh, I think we will, Alex. I really do." The first few weeks were pretty normal, all things considered. We settled into our jobs. I was at the visitor center. Eddie worked maintenance and explored Yosemite in our downtime. Hiking trails, taking photos of waterfalls, the usual tourist stuff. Eddie was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but he wasn't unfriendly. Just odd. He had these strange habits. He'd wake up before dawn every single day and go for these long walks in the woods. He'd come back smelling like damp earth and pine, his eyes even more wide and restless than usual. When I asked him where he went, he'd just shrug and say, "Exploring." Then there were the noises. Our cabin was deep in the employee housing area, surrounded by trees. At night, it got dark, like pitch black, can't see your hand in front of your face, dark and quiet, except for the sounds of the forest. But sometimes there were other sounds. Scraping, rustling, like something big moving around outside. Once I swore I heard something tapping on the cabin walls. A slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eddie one night, sitting up in bed. The tapping had started again. He was already sitting up, perfectly still, staring at the wall. "Hear what?" he said, his voice flat. "The tapping, like something's outside." He just blinked slowly. "Must be the wind," he said, and lay back down, turning away from me. But there was no wind that night. And the tapping kept going until I finally drifted off to sleep, or at least something like sleep. It felt more like being suspended in a state of anxious awareness, listening to the sounds of the woods and the unsettling silence of my roommate. Things started to get weirder after that night. The tapping continued almost every night, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there. Eddie's walks got longer, too. He'd leave even earlier, before the faintest hint of dawn, and sometimes not return until well after dark. He became even more withdrawn, if that was possible. Meals were eaten in silence, conversations dwindled to single words. The air in the cabin felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. One Saturday, I decided to hike the trail to Mirror Lake. It was a popular spot supposed to be beautiful, and I needed to get out of the cabin, away from the oppressive atmosphere. I invited Eddie, hoping to break through his shell a little. "Want to hike to Mirror Lake?" I asked, as he was meticulously cleaning his hiking boots, something else he did obsessively. He paused, his eyes flickering up to mine. "Mirror Lake," he repeated like he was tasting the words. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think so. You go ahead." "You sure?" "It's supposed to be amazing." He just shrugged again, turning back to his boots. "I have other plans," he mumbled, so I went alone. The hike was stunning, just like everyone said. The trail wound through towering pines, sunlight dappling through the leaves. Mirror Lake itself was breathtaking, reflecting half dome in its still, clear surface. But even surrounded by the beauty, I couldn't shake off the unease that had settled over me back at the cabin. As I started heading back down the trail, I noticed something odd. Off the main path, deeper in the woods, there was a faint trail barely visible. Curiosity got the better of me. I veered off the marked trail and followed the fainter one. It twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the trees, away from the lake and the other hikers. The air grew colder, the sunlight less frequent. Then I saw it. A small clearing hidden amongst the trees. And in the center of the clearing, something glinted in the dim light. I stepped closer, pushing aside branches, and my blood ran cold. It was a pile of bones. Animal bones mostly, I think. Deer, maybe, and smaller things. But mixed in with the animal bones were things that didn't look quite right. Smaller bones, more delicate. And something else, something pale and smooth, that I couldn't quite identify. A wave of nausea washed over me. I backed away slowly, stumbling, heart hammering in my chest. I had to get out of there. I had to get back to the cabin. And I had to know what Eddie was really doing on his early morning walks. I practically ran back to the cabin, the image of that bone pile seared into my mind. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick to my stomach. When I got back, Eddie was there, sitting on his bed, meticulously sharpening a small, silver knife. He looked up as I came in, his eyes strangely bright. "You're back early," he said, his voice almost a purr. I couldn't keep it in any longer. "Idiot, I went off the trail today, near Mirror Lake. I found something." He stopped sharpening the knife, tilting his head slightly, found something he repeated innocently, a clearing, with bones. Lots of animal bones, but other things too. "Eddie, what's going on?" He set the knife down carefully on the bedside table. Then he stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the darkening woods. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The tapping started again, faint but insistent, from somewhere outside the cabin walls. Thump, thump, thump. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. Yosemite, it's a special place, Alex. Old, powerful. Things linger here. What things, Eddie? What bones? I pressed, my voice trembling slightly. He turned away from the window, facing me fully for the first time since I'd gotten back. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and that unsettling smile was back, wider this time. The woods, they have their own ways, Alex. Their own needs. And sometimes they ask for things. He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away, bumping against the desk. The tapping outside grew louder, more insistent, like whatever was out there was getting closer too. T-U-M-P, yesh, T-U-M-P, and T-U-M-P. The tap, and I whispered, fear tightening its grip around my throat. That tapping, it's you, isn't it? Out there in the woods every night. Eddie's smile widened further, becoming something truly chilling. Not me, Alex, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Book us. The woods and I, we listen to each other. We understand each other. He took another step, and I could see the silver knife glinting on the table beside his bed. The tapping was deafening now, shaking the very walls of the cabin. T-U-M-P, enter T-U-M-P, T-U-M-P. And tonight, Alex said, his eyes locking onto mine, the woods, they're asking for something new. My roommates and I, we weren't exactly the outdoorsy type. Our idea of nature usually involved a picnic blanket in Central Park, or maybe a slightly ambitious hike if someone suggested it after one too many beers. So when I, Sarah, suggested a trip to Yellowstone National Park for our spring break, I was met with a mixture of blank stares and outright skepticism. Yellowstone. Seriously. Mike, ever the pragmatist, was the first to voice his doubts, adjusting his glasses with a sigh. Isn't that like bear country and jacers that could, explode? Jessica, always glued to her phone, looked from scrolling through Instagram, her brow furrowed. Will there be Wi-Fi? Because if I can't post pictures of, Old Faithful or whatever, what's the point? David, as usual, remained quiet, observing us with his unnervingly calm gaze. He was the enigma of our little roommate group, always there, always present, but somehow always just out of reach. You never quite knew what David was thinking, which I suppose was part of his strange charm. Despite their initial hesitations, I managed to convince them. I painted a picture of majestic mountains, steaming geysers, and bison roaming free. I promised Instagram-worthy views, beer, safe hikes maybe, and a break from our cramped city apartment. And surprisingly, they caved. Maybe it was the promise of escape, or maybe they were just tired of my relentless enthusiasm. But a week later, we were crammed into my beat-up Subaru, windows down, heading towards Wyoming. The drive itself was an experience. As we got closer to Yellowstone, the landscape transformed. Towering pines replaced city buildings, and the air grew crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something faintly sulfurous that tickled my nose. Even Mike, Mr. Skeptic, had to admit the scenery was impressive. Jessica was already snapping pictures out the window, and even David seemed a little more animated, his eyes scanning the passing wilderness with an intensity I hadn't seen before. We arrived at the park late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks. The air was cooler now, and the sulfurous smell was stronger, a constant reminder of the volcanic activity simmering beneath our feet. We checked into a small, slightly run-down cabin just outside the park's south entrance. It wasn't fancy, but it was quaint in a slightly unsettling way. The kind of place that felt like it had stories etched into its log walls, stories you weren't sure you wanted to hear. As we unpacked, a strange silence fell over us, different from our usual comfortable roommate quiet. It was a silence filled with the vastness of the wilderness around us, the rustling of unseen things in the woods, and the low, constant hum of the earth itself. Yellowstone was definitely different from Central Park, and somehow I had a feeling this trip was going to be different too. The first night in the cabin was restless. It wasn't just the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old wood settling, or the rustling sounds outside that could have been anything from a curious raccoon to something far less benign. It was a feeling, a subtle unease, that seemed to seep from the very walls of the cabin. Jessica complained about the lack of phone service almost immediately. Seriously, 0 bars. What is this, the Stone Age? She paced around the small living room, phone held aloft like some sort of desperate antenna, before finally collapsing onto the worn couch with a dramatic sigh. Mike, predictably, buried himself in a guidebook about Yellowstone, muttering about geothermal features and volcanic history. David just sat by the window, watching the deepening twilight paint long shadows across the trees, his expression unreadable. I tried to lighten the mood, suggesting we play cards or tell stories, but my enthusiasm fell flat. The silence in the cabin felt thick, almost suffocating. Even the crackling fire in the hearth seemed to emphasize the quiet rather than dispel it. As darkness fully enveloped the park, the sounds of the wilderness intensified. The wind whispered through the pines, sounding almost like hushed voices. We heard the distant howl of a coyote, mournful and lonely, and the chirping of crickets that seemed to grow louder and more frantic as the night wore on. Every sound was amplified in the stillness, each rustle and snap making us jump. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't the wind, or an animal, or the cabin settling. It was a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails gently drumming on wood. Tap, 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 it seemed to be coming from the wall behind my bed. I lay frozen, heart pounding, listening intently. Tap, 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 it was slow, deliberate, and utterly unnerving. I nudged Jessica, who was sleeping in the other bed in our room. "Jess, wake up," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Do you hear that?" She groaned and rolled over, pulling a pillow over her head. "Hear what?" "Go back to sleep, Sarah." I hesitated, unsure if I was imagining it. But then tap, tap, tap it came again, clearer this time. "Jessica, seriously, listen." I hissed, shaking her shoulder harder. She finally peeled one eye open, looking at me with bleary annoyance. What is it?" Just then the tapping stopped. Silence descended again, heavy and absolute. We both held our breath, straining our ears. Nothing. "See, nothing," Jessica mumbled, turning back over. "Probably just a branch hitting the wall. Go to sleep." But I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the darkness, listening, waiting. The tapping didn't return, but the feeling of unease lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. I stared at the wall, imagining something unseen on the other side, something listening back. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, filled with disjointed dreams of dark forests and whispering sounds. When I woke up the next morning, the cabin was bathed in the pale light of dawn. The tapping was gone, and the sounds of the wilderness seemed less menacing in the daylight. But the feeling remained, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense of being watched. And as I looked around at my still, sleeping roommates, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in Yellowstone, something in this cabin, was not quite right. This trip, I realized with a growing sense of dread, was turning out to be different in ways I hadn't imagined. Daylight in Yellowstone was deceptive. The sun streamed through the cabin windows, painting cheerful patterns on the log walls. The air smelled fresh and pinny, the sulfurous tang less pronounced. For a moment, the unease of the night before seemed to dissipate, like a bad dream fading with the morning light. We decided to start our exploration with a visit to Old Faithful. It was the quintessential Yellowstone experience, the postcard image, and even Jessica seemed grudgingly interested in seeing a geyser erupt. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, we piled back into the Subaru and drove into the heart of the park. The geyser basin was already bustling with tourists. We joined the throngs of people milling around the boardwalk, cameras clicking, voices buzzing with anticipation. The air here was thick with the smell of sulfur, a constant reminder of the volatile forces simmering beneath the surface. Steam vents hissed and bubbled, and the ground felt strangely warm underfoot. We found a spot near Old Faithful and waited. The predicted eruption time drew closer, and the crowd grew thicker, a sea of faces all turned towards the cone of the geyser. Then, with a low rumble that vibrated through the ground, it began. A plume of scalding water shot skyward, erupting with a roar that drowned out the chatter of the crowd. It was a truly impressive sight, a raw display of nature's power. Jessica, predictably, was busy filming the eruption for her non-existent phone service. Mike was engrossed in explaining the geological mechanics of geysers to anyone who would listen. David, however, was different. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the erupting geyser. His face pale and drawn, he looked almost afraid. As the eruption subsided and the crowd began to disperse, I noticed David was still staring at the geyser, his brow furrowed. "David, you okay?" I asked, touching his arm. He flinched as if startled out of a trance. "Yeah, fine," he said quickly, his voice tight. "Just thinking." He wouldn't elaborate, and I didn't push it. But his reaction had been strange, unsettling. It wasn't just the awe that everyone else was feeling. It was something darker, something almost like recognition. We spent the rest of the day exploring the geyser basin, walking along the boardwalks, marveling at the colorful hot springs and bubbling mud pots. But the earlier feeling of unease had returned, amplified by David's strange behavior and the constant, pervasive smell of sulfur. It felt like the park itself was breathing, a vast, ancient entity watching us with cold, indifferent eyes. Back at the cabin that evening, the atmosphere was even heavier than the night before. Jessica was sulking about the continued lack of Wi-Fi. Mike was still reading his guidebook, but he seemed more subdued, less enthusiastic. David was even quieter than usual, retreating into a corner of the living room, staring out the window at the deepening darkness. As dusk settled, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, rattling the windows. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And then we heard it again. Tap, 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 the rhythmic tapping, faint but distinct, coming from the wall. This time it wasn't just me. Jessica froze mid-complaint, her eyes widening. Mike lowered his guidebook, his brow furrowing. Even David turned from the window, his head cocked, listening intently. Tap, 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 it continued, slow, deliberate, and undeniably real. What is that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Mike frowned. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But it wasn't the wind. The tapping was too regular, too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was like something was trying to communicate, tapping out a message in the silence. As we all listened, frozen in place, the tapping grew slightly louder, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence descended again, broken only by the howling wind and the crackling fire. But this time, the silence felt different. It felt expectant, like the tapping wasn't just a random noise, but a prelude to something else. Something we weren't prepared for. Something in Yellowstone, I realized with a chilling certainty, was trying to get our attention. And I had a terrible feeling we were about to find out what it wanted. The silence after the tapping stopped was the most terrifying silence of all. It was a pregnant silence, heavy with anticipation, like the air before a lightning strike. We stood frozen, eyes wide, listening to the wind howl outside, the fire crackle in the hearth, and the frantic beating of our own hearts. Then it started again. But this time it wasn't tapping. It was a scratching. A slow, deliberate scrape, scrape, scrape against the wall behind the couch where David was sitting. David stiffened, his eyes widening in the firelight. He slowly turned his head towards the wall, his face ashen. The scratching continued, closer now, louder, as if whatever was on the other side was moving. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was definitely coming from inside the wall, not outside. And it was moving closer to us, circling the room, the sound tracing a path along the log walls. Jessica let out a choked whimper, scrambling back from the sound, bumping into Mike, who was also backing away, his guidebook forgotten on the floor. I felt a cold dread wash over me, paralyzing me in place. Only David remained still, his gaze fixed on the wall, his expression shifting from fear to something elsey, something like horrified fascination. The scratching reached the wall behind Jessica and Mike, then moved towards me. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I could feel the vibrations in the floorboards, the sound resonating in my bones. It was getting louder, closer, and I could hear other sounds now, faint rustling, like dry leaves being dragged across the floor, and a low, wet hissing. Suddenly, the scratching stopped directly behind me. The silence returned, but this time it was shattered by a new sound, a voice. Whispering, just barely audible, but undeniably a voice, coming from the wall right behind my head. It was a low, guttural whisper, like air escaping from a punctured lung. I couldn't make out words, just sibilant sounds, like Cest and Haka, but somehow I understood. It wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking about me. About us. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the sibilant sounds morphing into something that sounded almost like words. Distorted, broken, but words nonetheless. I thought I could hear my name. Sarah, Sarah, and then Jessica's Jessica and Mike's Mimicky, and then, finally, David's. But David's name was different. It wasn't whispered, it was called. David, the voice rasped, a low, yearning call that seemed to vibrate deep within my chest. David come home, and then David moved. He stood up slowly, his eyes wide and unfocused, a strange smile spreading across his face. He started walking towards the wall, towards the whispering voice, towards the scratching sound. David, David, what are you doing? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Jessica and Mike were huddled together, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. David didn't answer. He just kept walking, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. He reached the wall, the spot where the whispering seemed to be coming from, and stopped. He placed his hand flat against the rough log, his smile widening, becoming almost manic. David, no! Stop! I screamed, finally finding my voice. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him back. But his arm was cold, impossibly cold, and rigid like ice. He didn't even seem to notice me. David. The voice whispered again, closer now, right on the other side of the wall. And then the wall began to move. Not the whole wall, just a section of it, right in front of David. The logs seemed to warp and twist, the wood groaning and splintering. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep from the cracks, smelling of sulfur and something else, something rotten, something organic. And then the wall opened. Not like a door, but like flesh tearing open, a gaping maw appearing in the solid wood. A wave of heat and a sickeningly sweet, putrid smell washed over us. And from the darkness within the wall, something reached out. It was long and pale, impossibly thin, with too many joints, ending in a hand, if you could call it that, with long, skeletal fingers tipped with black, glistening claws. The hand reached for David's face, and he leaned into it, his smile ecstatic, his eyes closed as if in bliss. Jessica screamed a high-pitched, piercing shriek that echoed through the cabin. Mike stumbled backwards, tripping over the rug and falling to the floor with a thud. I stood frozen, watching in horror as the hand touched David's face, and he began to melt. It wasn't melting like ice cream in the sun. It was dissolving. His skin seemed to liquefy, his features blurring, his body losing its shape, flowing like wax towards the opening in the wall. The whispering voice grew louder, a chorus now, a cacophony of sibilant sounds and yearning calls, pulling David into the darkness. In seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the wall, absorbed into the darkness, leaving behind only a lingering stench of sulfur and rot, and the echoing screams of Jessica and the whimpering of Mike. The opening in the wall remained a dark, oozing wound in the cabin's wood, radiating heat and a palpable sense of hunger. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a low, satisfied hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath us. Jessica and Mike were huddled together, sobbing, pointing at the wall, babbling incoherently. I stood there numb, staring at the empty space where David had been, the dark stains spreading on the log wall. We had come to Yellowstone for an escape, for a break from the city, for Instagram-worthy views. We had found something else entirely, something ancient, something hungry, something that had been waiting in the heart of the wilderness, patiently tapping, scratching, whispering, until one of us finally answered the call. And now, in the silence of the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire and the wind howling outside, I knew with chilling certainty that Yellowstone had claimed one of us. And I had a terrible feeling that it wasn't finished yet. This strange roommate trip, I understood, wasn't just a deadly mistake. It was just the beginning. My name is Jake, and I'm what you call a creature of habit. Every morning starts the same alarm at 6:00 a.m., a quick shower, black coffee, and then without fail, 2 minutes of teeth, cleaning with my trusty Sonopulse 5000 electric toothbrush. It's a silly thing to be particular about, I know, but the rhythmic hum and the promise of purely whites just sets my day right. So, when my girlfriend, Emily, suggested a spontaneous weekend trip to Yellowstone National Park, my first thought wasn't about geezers or grizzly bears. It was, will I have access to an outlet to charge my toothbrush? Emily, bless her adventurous heart, just rolled her eyes. Jake, seriously, we're going to be surrounded by the wonders of nature, and you're worried about your toothbrush. It's not just a toothbrush, I argued, packing my bag. It's essential. Besides, I added with a grin, gotta keep these chompers sparkling for all those scenic photos. She laughed and shook her head, but secretly, I think she appreciated my quirks. We were opposites in many ways. Emily was spontaneous, loved the outdoors, and thrived on the unexpected. I was not. I preferred routine, the comfort of my apartment, and knowing exactly what to expect. That's probably why we worked a balance of chaos and order. The drive to Yellowstone was breathtaking. Towering pines, snow-capped mountains in the distance, and the crisp, clean air. Even I had to admit, nature had its charms. We checked into our cozy cabin just outside the park's west entrance as dusk began to settle. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, electricity included, thankfully. Vol.5 5,000, mission accomplished. After unpacking, we decided to take a short evening stroll before it got too dark. Emily, armed with a park map and infectious enthusiasm, led the way. "We're close to the Midway Geyser Basin," she announced, pointing to a spot on the map. "Let's just get a sneak peek at Grand Prismatic Spring before the crowds descend tomorrow." The air grew cooler as we walked, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling our nostrils. Even in the fading light, Yellowstone was undeniably beautiful. But there was something else too, an undercurrent, a feeling I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the vastness of the wilderness, or the strange, almost sulfurous smell that occasionally drifted on the breeze. Or maybe it was just my city's slicker nerves acting up. As we approached the Midway Geyser Basin, steam curled up from the earth, ghostly fingers reaching into the twilight sky. The boardwalks were deserted at this hour, and an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional hiss of escaping steam and our own hushed footsteps. We peered over the edge of the boardwalk at a smaller hot spring, its water a murky, unsettling gray. "Kind of creepy, right?" Emily whispered, a hint of thrill in her voice. "Just atmospheric," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, though a shiver had crept down my spine. I suddenly felt very far from my comfortable routine, very exposed in this wild, primeval place. Back at the cabin, as Emily busied herself making hot chocolate, I retreated to the bathroom. Time for my evening ritual. I reached for my Sonopulse 5000, plugged it into the outlet by the sink, and pressed the power button. Nothing, I frowned, checked the outlet, tried another one. Still nothing. Dead. My electric toothbrush, the anchor of my day, had betrayed me. Panic, irrational as it was, began to bubble in my chest. It was just a toothbrush, I told myself, but the silence in my hand felt wrong, ominous even. Emily entered, 2 steaming mugs in hand. "Trouble in toothbrush paradise," she teased, noticing my expression. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, looks like it's kaput. Guess I'm roughing it toothbrush-wise this weekend." She handed me a mug, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Welcome to the wilderness, Jake. Maybe you'll discover you can survive without your electric security blanket." I managed to smile, but as I sipped the hot chocolate, staring out at the darkening woods beyond the cabin window, a cold unease settled over me. It wasn't just about the toothbrush. It was something else, something in the air, something in this strange, beautiful, unsettling place. And I had a sinking feeling that my little toothbrush malfunction was just the first sign of things going very, very wrong. The next morning, the sun streamed through the cabin windows, painting the wooden walls in warm, golden light. Despite the lingering unease from the night before, the bright morning air felt like a fresh start. Emily was already up, humming cheerfully as she made coffee. "Morning, Grumpy," she chirped, handing me a steaming mug. "Sleep okay without your buzzing buddy?" I took a sip, the coffee strong and bitter. Surprisingly, yes, though I still feel off. "Just wilderness withdrawal," she teased. "Come on, let's hit Grand Prismatic early before the crowds get insane." The Midway Geyser Basin in daylight was a different beast altogether. The steam plumes were thicker, more voluminous, rising like ethereal beings from the vibrant, otherworldly landscape. The Grand Prismatic Spring itself was breathtaking, a kaleidoscope of impossible colors, rings of fiery orange, brilliant yellow, and deep, mesmerizing blue, all swirling and steaming under the clear Wyoming sky. We walked the boardwalk, snapping photos and marveling at the thermal features. Emily was in her element, pointing out different types of hot springs and geysers, rattling off facts from the park brochure. I tried to match her enthusiasm, but a persistent disquiet gnawed at me. It wasn't just the toothbrush anymore. It was everything. The silence felt too heavy, the air too still, even the vibrant colors of the spring seemed somehow unnatural, almost aggressive. As we walked, I noticed something else. other tourists, or rather, the lack of them. It was early, yes, but for such a popular spot, it felt strangely deserted. A few solitary figures dotted the boardwalks in the distance, but there was none of the usual chatter, no excited exclamations, just an unsettling quiet. I said, lower in my voice. Have you noticed how empty it is? She paused, looking around. Oh, yeah, I guess it's a bit quiet. Maybe it's just early. Or maybe, I murmured, a darker thought creeping in. Something's keeping people away. She scoffed. Don't be ridiculous, Jake. It's Yellowstone. What could scare people away? I didn't have an answer, but the feeling intensified as we continued our walk. We reached a smaller, less spectacular hot spring, tucked away slightly off the main boardwalk. It was a pool of milky, gray water, almost identical to the one we'd seen the night before. As we approached, a faint, metallic scent drifted on the breeze, acrid and unpleasant. Phew, what's that smell? Emily wrinkled her nose. Sulfur, probably, I said, though it smelled different, sharper, somehow. Like blood. I peered into the murky water. It was difficult to see anything in the cloudy depths, but as my eyes adjusted, I thought I saw something beneath the surface. A shape. Pale and indistinct, but definitely there. I said again, my voice barely a whisper. Look in the water. Do you see that? She leaned closer, her brow furrowed. See what? Just gray water and weight. Yeah. Is that something white? We stared, transfixed, as the shape slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted in the murky depths. It was long and thin, vaguely organic, and as it moved, a faint ripple disturbed the surface of the gray water, releasing another, stronger wave of that metallic, blood-like smell. Suddenly, Emily gasped, recoiling back from the edge of the boardwalk. Oh my God, Jake. I think that's a hand. My heart leaped into my throat. I strained my eyes, focusing on the shape in the water. And then I saw it too. The unmistakable outline of a human hand, pale and bloated, fingers splayed out in the murky depths. A wave of nausea washed over me. The unsettling quiet, the deserted boardwalks, the strange smell, the unnatural colors of the springs, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. We need to get out of here. I stammered, grabbing Emily's arm. No, we need to tell someone. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But what is it? What happened? I don't know, I said, pulling her back towards the main boardwalk, my voice trembling. But I don't want to find out. We practically ran back towards the parking lot, our footsteps echoing eerily in the unnatural silence. The vibrant beauty of Yellowstone, which had seemed so captivating just moments before, now felt menacing, sinister. The steam plumes looked like ghostly warnings, the colorful springs like poison pools. And the silence of the silence felt like the prelude to something truly terrifying. As we reached the car, I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. Emily was breathing heavily, her eyes darting around nervously. We were alone, completely, utterly alone. And in that moment, surrounded by the silent, steaming wilderness, I knew with chilling certainty that my broken electric toothbrush was the least of my worries. Our weekend trip to Yellowstone had just become a fight for survival. We scrambled into the car, locking the doors with a frantic click. My hands were still shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine sputtering to life with a sound that, under normal circumstances, would have been mundane, but now felt like a lifeline. I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel as we backed out of the parking spot, and sped back towards the park entrance. Did you see it clearly? Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. The hand. Was it really? I don't want to think about it, I said, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing us. We need to get to a ranger station. Tell them what we saw. The drive to the west entrance felt like an eternity. The park, once beautiful and intriguing, now seemed to leer at us from the side of the road. Towering trees became menacing figures, shadows stretched like grasping claws, and every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered threat. We passed no other cars, saw no other people. The radio crackled with static, offering no comfort, no news, just an unsettling silence punctuated by bursts of white noise. Finally, we reached the west entrance station. Relief flooded me as I saw the familiar wooden structure, the sign proclaiming Yellowstone National Park West Entrance. But even the ranger station seemed deserted. The entrance booth was empty, the gate arm raised and motionless. No rangers, no other cars, just silence again. "This isn't right," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Veer is everyone." I pulled the car up to the booth and honked the horn, long and loud. Silence. I honked again and again until the sound echoed unnervingly through the empty landscape. Still nothing. "Maybe they're just inside," I said, trying to sound optimistic, but the knot in my stomach tightened. I put the car in park and cautiously opened the door, stepping out into the unnerving stillness. The air was heavy, thick with that metallic, blood-like scent. No stronger, almost suffocating. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. "Ranger. Is anyone here?" Only silence answered. Emily joined me, her face pale and drawn. We walked towards the ranger station building, the wooden planks of the walkway creaking ominously under our feet. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, a primal fear gripping me. What if whatever was in that hot spring was here too? Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The ranger station was dimly lit, the air inside stale and cold. Desks were overturned, chairs scattered, paper strewn across the floor. It looked like chaos, like people had fled in a hurry. "Oh my God." Emily breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "What happened here?" We moved further into the station, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. On one desk, a radio lay on its side, static hissing from the speaker. On another, a half-eaten sandwich sat abandoned, attracting a swarm of flies. And then I saw it. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, a single word. Began DRNK. The blood drained from my face. "Don't drink." What did that even mean? Don't drink what? The water, the coffee, the hot chocolate Emily had made last night. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence. A low, guttural moan coming from somewhere deeper within the station. My blood ran cold. We froze, listening, hearts pounding in our chests. The moan came again, closer this time, followed by a shuffling sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. "Jake," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" I didn't know, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that we didn't want to find out. "Run," I hissed, grabbing her hand and pulling her back towards the door. "Just run." We burst out of the ranger station and sprinted back to the car, adrenaline surging through our veins. The moaning sound followed us, growing louder, closer. I fumbled with the keys again, my hands slick with sweat, finally managing to unlock the door. We dove into the car, slamming the doors shut just as something crashed against the side of the building with a sickening thud. I didn't look back. I just started the engine, slammed the gas pedal, and we roared out of the west entrance, leaving the deserted ranger station and whatever was inside it behind us. We drove, not stopping, not speaking, just fleeing the silent, terrifying wilderness of Yellowstone and the chilling message scrawled in blood. DONTRINK. But drink what? And what in God's name was happening in that park? The questions haunted me, swirling in my mind like the murky, gray water of that cursed hot spring, as we sped away from what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, and into a nightmare I couldn't even begin to comprehend. We drove for hours, not stopping until the sun had begun to set again, casting long, eerie shadows across the highway. We were miles away from Yellowstone, far outside the park boundaries, but the silence of the wilderness still clung to us, a chilling residue of what we'd experienced. Finally, we pulled into a small town, finding a brightly lit diner that felt like a haven of normalcy in the encroaching darkness. Inside, the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation were almost overwhelming after the oppressive quiet of Yellowstone. We ordered coffee, our hands still trembling as we held the warm mugs. The waitress, a friendly woman with tired eyes, gave us a sympathetic smile. "Rough day?" she asked, noticing our pale faces. Emily managed a weak smile. "You could say that." We didn't tell her about the hand in the hot spring, or the deserted ranger station, or the blood-scrawled warning. It sounded too insane, too unbelievable, even to our own ears. Instead, we focused on the mundane, the comforting routine of ordering food, of being surrounded by other people, of simply being away from Yellowstone. As we ate, I couldn't shake the image of that word, burned into my mind. DONTRINK. Don't drink what? It had to be the water, right? Yellowstone was famous for its thermal features, its hot springs and geysers. What if the water was contaminated? But contaminated with what? Something that could drive people away. Something that could turn a ranger station into a scene of chaos. Something that could leave things floating in hot springs. I pulled out my phone, my fingers still clumsy as I typed in Yellowstone National Park water contamination. The search results were sparse. Mostly routine Park Service announcements about keeping a safe distance from thermal features, warnings about bacteria in untreated water sources. Nothing about widespread contamination, nothing about hands in hot springs. Then I refined my search. Yellowstone National Park illness outbreak. This time, a few articles popped up, mostly local news reports from the past few days. Headlines like, Unexplained illness spreads in Yellowstone region. Park officials investigate mystery sickness. Tourists report bizarre symptoms after Yellowstone visit. My blood ran cold as I scanned the articles. The reports were vague, filled with official-sounding reassurances, but the underlying message was clear: something was happening in Yellowstone. People were getting sick, exhibiting strange symptoms: nausea, disorientation, hallucinations, even violent outbursts. And it seemed to be spreading rapidly. One article mentioned that the illness was suspected to be waterborne, possibly linked to the park's unique geothermal activity. Another quoted a park ranger anonymously who hinted at something unnatural happening in the thermal basins. Unnatural. That word resonated with the chilling unease I'd felt in the park, the sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Suddenly, a thought struck me, so obvious, so terrifyingly simple that I almost missed it. Emily, I said, my voice hoarse. The hot chocolate last night. You made it with cabin water, right? Her eyes widened in dawning horror. Yes, I boiled it, of course, but yeah, it was just tap water from the cabin. Oh God, Jake, do you think? A wave of nausea washed over me, stronger than before. The metallic taste in the air, the blood-like smell, the warning. Duran K. It wasn't just about drinking from the hot springs. It was about drinking anything in Yellowstone. The water itself was the source, the carrier, the vector of whatever sickness, whatever thing was infecting the park. And then I remembered something else. Something small, seemingly insignificant, but now, in the cold light of this horrifying realization, profoundly disturbing. My electric toothbrush, Sonopulse 5000, and it had stopped working. Dead. No power. In a cabin with electricity. It made no sense. Emily, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Remember my toothbrush. It stopped working. Just died. In the cabin. She looked at me, confusion and fear warring in her eyes. Yeah, so. Maybe it just broke. Nope, I said, my voice trembling. I don't think so. Think about it. Electric toothbrush. Water. Cleaning teeth water. Understanding dawned in her eyes, stark and terrifying. Oh my God, she breathed, her voice barely audible. You don't think the water, it's its effect in electronics. It was a leap, a wild, irrational leap. But in the context of everything we'd seen, everything we'd felt, it made a horrifying kind of sense. The unnatural silence, the deserted park, the violent illness, the creature in the hot spring, the blood-scrawled warning, and now my dead electric toothbrush. All connected. All pointing to something wrong with the water. Something that wasn't just making people sick, but something else. Suddenly, I felt a strange tingling sensation in my mouth, on my teeth, a faint metallic taste, almost like electricity. My heart leaped into my throat. I looked at Emily, her eyes wide with panic, mirroring my own terror. We'd drunk the hot chocolate. We'd used the cabin water. We'd been exposed. The waitress returned with our food, her cheerful smile now seeming grotesquely out of place. We stared at the plates, suddenly revolted by the sight of food, by the very act of eating, of drinking, of living. Because now I understood. It wasn't just a deadly mistake to bring my electric toothbrush to Yellowstone. It was a deadly mistake to drink the water. And we had. The tingling in my mouth intensified, spreading through my jaw, up into my face. I could feel something changing, shifting inside me. A cold dread washed over me, a certainty that this was just the beginning. Or a weekend trip to Yellowstone hadn't just been a deadly mistake. It had been a one-way ticket to something unimaginable. And it all started with a broken electric toothbrush and a cup of hot chocolate made with cursed water. And now, as the lights of the diner seemed to flicker and dim, and the friendly chatter around us faded into a distant hum, I knew. with chilling certainty that the nightmare had only just begun.